if he can, try to explain to us where he sees the defects in our resolution insofar as it almost virtually is identical to the text of the resolution proposed by the U.S. and supplements it with all other forms of weapons which we believe must not be placed in outer space. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize for taking the floor, but I obviously need to respond to the remarks made by the Russian representative. In answer to his question, yes, I read your bad text. Your text includes a lengthy binding mechanism that cannot be verified. That is clear. We have had those discussions in Geneva before with regard to the type of treaty that you would like to see come into place. So we've seen this movie before. What I would submit to my Russian colleague is that we let the Council decide on his text, and we're about to do that. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/383, please raise their hand. Those against? Those abstaining? The result of the voting is as follows: 7 votes in favor, 7 votes against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. The first on the list is the representative of Algeria. You have.
Mr. President, Algeria voted in favor of the draft resolution as it aligns with our long-standing position on the peaceful use of outer space and the prevention from its weaponization. As outlined in our constant position, Algeria firmly believes that outer space is the common heritage of humankind. It must be explored and utilized for the benefit of all nations, irrespective of their level of economic or scientific development. The draft resolution rightly calls upon all states, particularly those with major space capabilities, to actively contribute to the objective of peaceful use and prevent an arms race in outer space. We reiterate the importance of all states to refrain from actions that contradict this objective and existing treaties in the interest of maintaining international peace and security. The text commendably made reference to key documents such as the Outer Space Treaty, the NPT, and the Space 2030 Agenda, underlining the importance of international law and the crucial role of the Conference on Disarmament in negotiating multilateral agreements. Its emphasis on strict compliance with the Outer Space Treaty and other relevant legal instruments is crucial. Upholding and promoting universal adherence to these treaties is essential for preserving outer space for peaceful purposes. The draft resolution rightly underscores the urgent need for further measures, including legal binding instruments, to prevent an arms race in outer space. We have consistently championed the importance of negotiating such instruments. To conclude, Algeria reiterates its unwavering commitment to the prevention of an arms race in outer space and the preservation of outer space for peaceful purposes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea voted against the resolution for two reasons. First, the Russian draft contained the language which did not reach consensus among Security Council members. Among this was one operative paragraph, OP8, which was identical to the Russian amendment not adopted at the previous meeting on April 24th. Given the dual-use nature of many space systems, it is very difficult to define a weapon in space, and so is the verification on compliance, even if we have a legally binding agreement. Ambiguity may lead to legal divergence and open the door to the intentional evasion of legal obligations. That is why many states, including the Republic of Korea, believe that we need to further develop rules, norms, and principles in order to address and tackle the present and the potential threats in the space domain in a relevant manner. The Russian text did not properly reflect these views. Second, the draft was put to vote without sufficient consultations. Despite several council members' requests to have the resolution be balanced, the Russian Federation barely changed the text and put it in blue text as soon as the non-objection procedure was broken. Apparently, Russia was not intent on conducting the negotiations in good faith. This is all the more regrettable because Russia vetoed a draft resolution on the same topic, which enjoyed 13 votes of support, including E10 within the Council. Taking this opportunity, the Republic of Korea would like to emphasize that the Security Council needs to be more proactive in addressing emerging security challenges, especially in the space and the cyber domains. Throughout its term in the Security Council, the Republic of Korea stands ready to work with other Council members to make the Security Council more agile and relevant in maintaining international peace and security in our rapidly changing world. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Malta voted against this resolution, which failed to include the views of many Council members. We have done so on substance and, even more so, on procedural grounds. With regards to the text, while largely based on the resolution presented by Japan and the US, this draft removed key elements, including the reference to the applicability of international law in outer space. Such reference was supported by many Council members, and we regret its deletion. Furthermore, this draft contained two additional non-consensual OPs, which sought to divide the Council rather than achieving consensus. In fact, the same language contained in one of the two OPs was recently voted down in this very room when it was presented as an amendment to the resolution by Japan and the United States. On the other hand, we are disappointed by the approach adopted by the penholder. It is regrettable to see that a permanent member first vetoed a resolution on this topic, stressing that the Council should not discuss outer space and should not reaffirm existing obligations, only to then present its own draft on the same topic. Moreover, after only one round of consultations, it placed under silence a text that failed to address almost all of the concerns expressed by other members. This is not striving for consensus. This is not how we advance the interests of the wider UN membership. Initiatives like this only contribute to discrediting this body. As we have said before, we had a timely opportunity to adopt the first Security Council resolution on outer space and reaffirm the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. We missed this when the resolution was vetoed last month. Our collective goal is to ensure that outer space remains a peaceful domain for the benefit of all humankind. As space capabilities continue to increase, we believe that this Council should play a role in addressing these threats to international peace and security. To conclude, we once again reaffirm our principled position against all nuclear weapons and WMDs in outer space, on Earth, and anywhere. We stand ready to engage constructively on outer space discussions in all relevant fora, including the Security Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by reminding you all of what our Russian colleague stated in this chamber just a few weeks ago. He stated in this chamber, quote, "The discussion of space security issues and the decisions taken should be comprehensive and should involve all the UN members. Otherwise, this is nothing but an obvious attempt to impose the opinion of UN Security Council members on the rest of the UN membership." End of quote. The same delegation now proposed a draft resolution on outer space security to this Council, which the rest of the UN membership would not accept. We cannot find consistency in their approach. Throughout the negotiation on this draft text, our delegation made its best efforts to find compromise by offering concrete proposals to converge the divergent views among the Council members. We regret that the penholder did not fully take into account such constructive suggestions and decided to put forward a text with a number of divisive elements. For example, on the prevention of arms race in outer space, while there is consensus to take further measures and appropriate international negotiations in accordance with the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty at this stage, there is no consensus among UN member states on a specific way forward. That is why the General Assembly and the Conference on Disarmament continue to discuss this important issue. Maintaining the peaceful nature of outer space is greatly relevant to the work of the Security Council. However, we believe the Council should complement the efforts made in other relevant fora rather than preempting or prejudging the result of such efforts. Japan reiterates its strong commitment to ensuring the security, stability, and sustainability of outer space and the objective of preventing an arms race in outer space. However, significant challenges remain in defining and verifying a weapon in outer space. This derives from the dual-use nature of space objects and technologies, as well as the need to address space threats in a comprehensive manner. In order to address security challenges in outer space, it is crucial to focus on how certain objects or capabilities are applied and used. Based on this position, we voted against on today's voting. Before concluding, there's another note I would like to emphasize. This draft resolution in OP7 calls upon UN member states not to develop nuclear weapons or any other kinds of WMD specifically designed to be placed in outer space. We are pleased to see that the proponents of this resolution are now ready to proactively commit to this important principle, which Japan and the United States wanted to deliver in our draft resolution presented last month. Outer space must never be an arena for a nuclear arms race. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, garantir l'utilisation pacifique, sûre et durable de l'espace extra-atmosphérique contribue à notre sécurité et à notre prospérité. C'est un intérêt commun de tous les États. Il incombe non seulement aux organes dédiés, mais aussi à ce Conseil de préserver l'espace pour les générations futures. La Suisse insiste sur le fait que les différentes approches de la sécurité spatiale sont complémentaires. Nous restons attachés à notre position selon laquelle il faut impérativement prévenir une course aux armements, ainsi qu'un conflit armé dans l'espace extra-atmosphérique. Et à cette fin, le placement de tous les types d'armes, y compris les armes conventionnelles, devrait être interdit. Pour atteindre ces objectifs, nous pensons qu'il est nécessaire de développer des normes relatives au comportement responsable, ainsi que des instruments juridiquement contraignants. Après la négociation de la résolution présentée par le Japon et les États-Unis, qui a malheureusement échoué face au veto, et en examinant le projet actuel de la Russie, nous pensons qu'il y aurait suffisamment de points communs pour parvenir à un consensus. Bien que nous soutenons plusieurs éléments du projet présenté, nous regrettons que l'esprit de flexibilité est un cadre de confiance et fait défaut et que nos suggestions visant à produire un texte qui nous unisse au lieu de nous diviser n'aient pas été prises en compte. Nous avons donc décidé de nous abstenir sur ce projet. Ce Conseil devrait pourtant agir dans un esprit de coopération et faire des enjeux tels que la sûreté dans l'espace un terrain d'entente commun, plutôt qu'une arène de confrontation où chacun tente de marquer le point. Nous regrettons que cela n'ait pas été le cas cette fois-ci et espérons que les prochaines occasions seront saisies pour rapprocher les positions et parvenir à des terrains d'entente. La Suisse souligne que la mise en œuvre des dispositions du traité de l'ONU sur l'espace est obligatoire pour tous les États parties et nous appelons une nouvelle fois tous les États qui ne l'ont pas encore fait à y adhérer sans délai. La Suisse reste convaincue qu'il est nécessaire et possible de s'accorder sur un produit au sein de ce Conseil, sur un sujet aussi important pour la sécurité internationale et la prospérité de chacun de nos pays. Nous appelons tous les membres à s'unir et à rechercher des solutions en mettant l'accent sur les points communs plutôt que sur les divergences, afin d'obtenir des résultats qui fassent progresser le désarmement plutôt que d'aggraver les divisions. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. The United Kingdom is committed to preventing an arms race in outer space. That is why we introduced a resolution in the General Assembly last year establishing norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviour to reduce threats to space systems. It was adopted with the overwhelming support of 166 member states. And it is why the UK supported the US and Japan draft resolution in this Council, which sought to affirm the basic obligations of the Outer Space Treaty and prevent any nuclear weapons being placed in orbit around Earth. The detonation of a nuclear weapon in space could destroy or permanently damage a significant proportion of satellites in orbit around Earth, with highly disruptive and potentially life-threatening consequences for the essential space technology applications that we all rely on. It should be deeply concerning to all of us that Russia vetoed that resolution. Russia's counter-resolution that we voted on today was simply not credible. It was a cynical attempt to distract attention away from reports that Moscow is developing a new satellite carrying a nuclear device. The resolution was built around language that was voted down just a few weeks ago by this Council and was widely opposed again in negotiations. So why put it to a vote today? This was not a serious attempt to address the security of space. And Russia knows very well its proposals were not verifiable or enforceable. Coming from a country which has flouted so many obligations in arms control, this raises the red flag. Let me remind you of Russia's recent track record. Plans to withdraw ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, withdrawal from Open Skies and the Comprehensive Forces in Europe treaties, suspending participation in New START, violating the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention, and, of course, breaching this Council's resolutions on Iran and DPRK. Colleagues, we need to redouble efforts to avoid an arms race in outer space and to ensure our collective security. That requires serious, good faith discussion about the arms control architecture. We remain ready and willing to engage in those as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, Guyana voted in favor of the draft resolution titled The Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space and Outer Space Security, presented by the Russian Federation. We supported the draft resolution as it is consistent with our positions on General Assembly Resolution 78/238 and Draft Security Council Resolution S/2024/302, which was presented by Japan and the United States less than a month ago on the prevention of nuclear weapons in outer space, but unfortunately was not adopted due to Russia's veto. As a nation committed to the equitable and peaceful use of outer space, we recognize the importance of this draft resolution call for space to be free from all weapons. The prospect of weaponizing this domain poses a grave threat not only to global security, but also to the future of humanity's shared heritage in space. In this regard, we believe the draft text, which was not adopted, could have contributed to averting this grave threat. Guyana underscores that outer space must remain free of all weapons, including weapons of mass destruction. It is crucial that we safeguard this shared global common from the scourge of arms races, which can only exacerbate the threats to our collective security and hinder our development agendas. Mr. President, Guyana reiterates the importance of nuclear weapon states upholding their international obligations and committing to not place nuclear weapons in outer space. We also reiterate our commitment to supporting efforts that guarantee the right of all countries to benefit equitably from the peaceful use of outer space. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President.
El Ecuador está firmemente
Ecuador is
comprometido con la
firmly
promoción de la
committed
paz
to
y la
promoting
seguridad
international
internacionales
peace and
y
security,
cree que la regulación de
and
las
believes
actividades
that
en el espacio
regulating
extraterrestre
activities in outer
es uno de los
space is
elementos
one of the
esenciales de la
essential
arquitectura
elements of the
necesaria
necessary
para
architecture
garantizar
in
su
order to
sostenibilidad a
guarantee
largo plazo.
its long-term sustainability.
Por ello,
For this
fiel a sus
reason,
principios y
faithful
coherente
to
con
our
su posición,
principles and in
el país votó a
coherent with
favor de
our
la
own
propuesta
position,
de
my country
resolución.
voted in favor of the
El
draft
Ecuador
resolution.
reconoce la
Ecuador
importancia de
recognizes the
preservar el
importance
espacio
of
ultraterrestre
preserving
como
outer
un entorno
space
pacífico
as a peaceful
y se opone a su anarquización
place and
y más aún a
opposes
su
anarchy in
militarización,
space and
lo
still
cual
more the
incluye el
militarization of
emplazamiento de
space, which
cualquier
would
tipo
include
de
the placement
armamento,
of any kind of
especialmente
weapon,
de armas de
particularly
destrucción en masa.
weapons of mass destruction.
No se puede soslayar
There is no
que la base
avoiding
del
the
texto
fact that
sometido
the
a
basis of the
consideración de
text
este
put
Consejo
to
se
this
basa en
Council's
el proyecto
consideration
vetado el
was
pasado
based on
24 de
the
abril,
draft which was vetoed on the
incluyendo el
24th
lenguaje
of
de la
April,
enmienda que no
including
contó con el
language
número
from
de
the
votos
amendment which did
necesarios
not receive
para
the
su
number of
adopción,
favourable votes for its
por lo que era
adoption,
previsible un
meaning
resultado
that a similar
análogo.
outcome was
¿Por qué
predictable.
enfrentar a este Consejo un
Why
proceso
put this
inútil
Council through a
sobre el cual ya se
useless
conocía su
process
resultado?
when the result was already
Es
known?
preocupante la polarización y la
There is a
confrontación
worrisome and
crecientes
increasing
en la consideración de
polarisation,
temas que competen a
confrontation
este
in
Consejo
considering
y
matters
que
within the
imponen a
mandate
todos
of
sus
this
miembros
Council.
una
Such matters
responsabilidad
confer
individual y
upon its
colectiva en
members
la
an
búsqueda de
individual and
soluciones
collective
constructivas
responsibility
para
to
enfrentar
seek
los desafíos
constructive
globales,
solutions to face
incluida
global
la cuestión
challenges,
de las armas
including
en
the
el espacio
questions of weapons in
intraterrestre.
outer space.
No debemos
We must
politizar el
not
Consejo de
politicize the
Seguridad
Security
y
Council
utilizarlo como una arena
and
más
use it as
donde
just
se
one
reflejen
more
las
arena
tensiones
which
geopolíticas
exposes
actuales.
today's geopolitical
Para concluir,
tensions. To
señor
conclude,
presidente,
President,
reafirmo el
I
compromiso del
reaffirm
Ecuador de
Ecuador's
continuar
commitment
actuando
to
de acuerdo
continue
con
to
los
act
principios de
in
la Carta de las
accordance with
Naciones
the
Unidas
principles of the
sobre
Charter
la
of the
base del
United Nations
diálogo
upon the
y
basis
la
of
cooperación
dialogue
entre
and
sus miembros.
cooperation
Muchas
between its
gracias.
members. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le
I
Président.
thank you, President.
La France a voté
France
contre
voted
le projet de
against
résolution
the draft
présenté aujourd'hui.
resolution tabled today.
Nous déplorons la
We
méthode
deplore
d'obstruction qui a
the
été employée par la
obstructive
Russie,
methods used
qui ne
by
cherchait
Russia,
manifestement qu'à
who was
diviser le
clearly
Conseil
only
et à
seeking
renverser la
to divide the
responsabilité de
Council
l'échec de ce
and
projet de
place the
texte
responsibility for the
sans
failure of this
sincèrement
draft
soutenir les
text
objectifs.
without
Le vote de la
really
France aujourd'hui
supporting its
reflète notre
objectives.
refus de la méthode.
Today's vote
Le
reflects
24
our
avril,
refusal
la
of the
Russie
method. On
opposait
the
son
24th
veto
of
au
April,
projet de résolution
Russia
sur l'espace
vetoed the draft resolution
extra-atmosphérique
on
qui a
outer
été
space,
préparé par les États-Unis
as
et le
prepared by the
Japon.
United States and
Nous
Japan.
souhaitons saluer une nouvelle fois les
We wish once
efforts qui
again
avaient été
to welcome
déployés
and
par
commend
ces
the
deux
efforts
États
deployed by these
au
two
cours de
states
discussions ouvertes pour
during
parvenir
open
à un
discussions in
compromis.
order to achieve a
Leur projet réaffirmait
compromise. Their
l'importance du
draft
traité de
reaffirmed the importance of the
1967 qui est le fondement du
1967
droit
treaty, which is
international
the basis
spécial.
of international space
Il
law.
soulignait le rôle
And
d'instances
it underlined
spécialisées
the
comme
role
la
of
conférence du
specialized bodies such
désarmement
as
pour
the
continuer à
Disarmament Conference
développer
in order to
le régime
continue
juridique
developing the
applicable
legal
à
framework which will be
l'espace.
applicable to space.
Après avoir bloqué
After
seule
having
l'adoption de ce
alone
texte,
blocked the
la
adoption
Russie
of this
soumet au
text,
Conseil un
Russia
projet
put to the
alternatif
Council an
dont
alternative
15
draft
paragraphes sont
with
issus
15
directement de la
paragraphs which
proposition
came
portée
directly
par les
from the
États-Unis et
proposal
le
of the
Japon.
United States and
Il est
Japan.
permis de s'étonner que la Russie
It
ait opposé son veto à un texte dont elle s'est inspirée aussi
It's
largement
astonishing
pour
that
son
Russia
propre projet.
vetoed something which it used
La
as an
position de la
inspiration for
France
its own
est claire.
draft.
Nous
France's
soutenons
position
les
is clear.
paragraphes
We
qui
support
rappellent le
those
rôle du
paragraphs
traité
which
de
recall the role of the
1967,
1967
mais la Russie
treaty,
cherche à
but
imposer de
Russia is
nouvelles
seeking to
dispositions
impose
qui n'ont fait
new
qu'éloigner le
provisions
Conseil
which
d'un accord.
distance the Council
Ces
from any
ajouts
agreement. These
visent à introduire
additions
des références à
aim
la
to bring in
proposition d'un
references
traité sur
to
la
the
prévention du
draft
placement d'armes dans
treaty on the
l'espace.
placement of weapons in
Cette
outer
proposition ne
space,
recueille pas le
which does
consensus
not
et elle fait
enjoy
l'objet de débats
consensus
dans
and
les
is
enceintes de
being discussed
désarmement.
in
La France
disarmament
nourrit des
bodies.
réserves à l'égard de cette
France has
proposition de
reservations
traité
about this draft
qui se
treaty,
heurterait à l'écueil de la
which
définition des
would
termes
have
et de la
problems
mise en
with
place
definition of
de
terms
mécanismes
and
effectifs
establishing
de
effective
vérification.
verification mechanisms.
Lors des négociations sur ce
During
projet de
negotiations
résolution,
on this
sur ce
draft
projet de résolution,
resolution,
nous avons appelé, comme de nombreux
we
autres membres du
have, like
Conseil,
many
à
other
ne
members of
pas
the Council,
préjuger des
called
débats en
not
cours
to
dans les enceintes de désarmement.
guess
Dans
the
un
current
esprit de
dates happening in
compromis,
disarmament
nous avions accepté
institutions.
que le projet
As
ne
by way
mentionne
of
pas la
compromise, we
réduction des
accepted
menaces
the draft
spatiales
not
par la
mentioning the threats
définition
of
de
space
normes de
in
comportement
definitions
responsables,
of
alors que
norms for
170
responsible behavior.
États avaient soutenu
Although
la
70
résolution
states
promouvant
had
cette approche en
supported
première
resolutions
commission de
promoting such
l'Assemblée
an approach
générale.
in the First Committee of the General
La
Assembly.
Russie, pour sa part, a
For its
persisté
part, Russia
à vouloir
persisted
introduire dans
in
le
wanting
texte
to
la
bring into
proposition
the
de
text
traité
the
et elle savait qu'une
proposal for a
majorité de membres
treaty
du Conseil
when
ne
it
la
knew that a
soutenait.
majority of the members of the Council did not
C'est ce
support
refus de
this. It
négociation,
is this
tout
refusal
comme
to
le veto qu'elle a
negotiate
utilisé
and the
il y a
veto
quelques
which it
semaines,
used a few weeks ago,
qui permettent de douter de la
which allows us
crédibilité
to cast doubt on
qui
the
est celle de la
credibility
Russie lorsqu'elle
of Russia
prétend unir
when it
la communauté
claims to
internationale dans
bring
la
together the
négociation the international community in negotiating an agreement on the prevention of an arms race in outer space.
Monsieur le Président, il est dans l'intérêt de tous que l'espace extra-atmosphérique demeure sûr, stable et qu'il soit utilisé à des fins pacifiques. La France est attachée au respect du traité de 1967, du droit international ainsi qu'à la prévention d'une course aux armements dans l'espace. Pour avancer vers cet objectif, elle est mobilisée dans les discussions des enceintes compétentes du désarmement, y compris sur la définition d'engagements politiques et d'instruments contraignants appropriés. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone reaffirms its commitment to promoting peace, security, and stability in outer space and beyond. In line with our principal stance on preventing the weaponization of outer space, Sierra Leone voted on 24th April 2024 in favor of the previous draft resolution, which was sponsored by Japan and the US and co-sponsored by 65 member states on weapons of mass destruction in outer space, which was not adopted owing to a non-concurring vote of a permanent member. We also voted for the amendment proposed by the Russian Federation and China, recognizing the urgent need for measures to prevent the placement of weapons in outer space. Sierra Leone has voted in favor of this draft resolution S/2024/383 to re-echo our consistent and fundamental belief in the peaceful uses of outer space and prevent any potential militarization. We observe that the draft resolution sponsored by the Russian Federation largely comprises elements of the draft Security Council resolution co-authored by Japan and the US, which was not adopted. We recognize the concerns of some Security Council members regarding a lack of broad consensus on broad elements of the draft. However, the urgency of preventing any militarization of outer space necessitates strong and decisive measures. Sierra Leone family believes that the adoption of any resolution which calls for the prevention of an arms race in outer space is a pivotal step towards mitigating the risk. In conclusion, Sierra Leone remains dedicated to the pursuit of peace and security in outer space. Our vote in favor of the draft resolution signifies our commitment to maintaining outer space as a sanctuary for peaceful activities, free from threats, military confrontation, and conflicts prevalent on Earth, a realm where humanity can unify in the pursuit of knowledge, exploration, and mutual advancement. We call upon all member states to collaborate honestly in future negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament to develop a universally accepted, legally binding framework that will safeguard our shared outer space heritage for the betterment of present and future generations. Sierra Leone stands ready to continue its constructive engagement in these vital discussions to ensure that outer space remains a secure and peaceful environment for present and future generations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Slovenia regrets to see another divisive vote on a topic that should unite us. Slovenia engaged in good faith, with openness and flexibility, in the negotiations of this resolution, with the aim to ensure a safe and secure space environment. We proposed a number of amendments, however, none of our concerns were taken on board. We underlined that the international space law, with the Outer Space Treaty at its center, represents the cornerstone of the global governance of outer space. They include central provisions on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, with the prohibition of placement of weapons of mass destruction above Earth's atmosphere. These obligations need to be reiterated and strengthened in order to avoid potentially harmful interference with the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. Mr. President, Slovenia supports the majority of the submitted text. However, the proposal put forward by the Russian Federation does not effectively address the many challenges associated with the prevention of an arms race in outer space, and would, in our view, have ambiguous implications for the security of outer space. And for these reasons, we voted against this resolution. That being said, Slovenia remains steadfast in its commitment to the prevention of an arms race in outer space. It supports strengthening of existing commitments through norms, rules and principles of responsible behavior, as well as legally binding measures. We reaffirm our dedication to engaging constructively in all efforts aimed at ensuring the peaceful use of outer space for the benefit of present and future generations. We urge all spacefaring nations to exercise restraint and refrain from actions that could lead to weaponization of outer space. We appeal to them to demonstrate responsible behavior in order to secure a peaceful and sustainable use of outer space. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we on the whole are pleased with the results of the vote. Beyond the figures, the vote has demonstrated a watershed between those who are striving towards peaceful use of outer space and those who are moving towards militarization of outer space. Western countries have today essentially turned out to be isolated at the Security Council, and this is symptomatic. We deeply regret the fact that these Western countries, the members of the Security Council, today did not allow the Security Council to adopt a balanced and so necessary resolution today to keep outer space exclusively for peaceful purposes. In this way today, they have definitively cast aside their masks, they have unmasked themselves, and they have presented themselves as they truly are today before us. Just last month, the United States and their allies, with their inherent cynicism, were beating their chests, loudly proclaiming their commitments to peaceful outer space. And today, after they confirmed and showed their real intention to continue to militarize outer space and to continue to develop the relevant weapons, what is particularly cynical and hypocritical are their attempts to justify their actions with the allegedly non-consensual nature of our draft. Not to mention the sudden awakening of their recognition of the importance of discussing the question of preventing an arms race in outer space at specialized disarmament fora. For this is the position which they criticized Russia for just a few weeks ago. And today, this is something which the Japanese representative tried to then put the ball in our court. However, we all recall that you, ladies and gentlemen, placed this subject on the agenda of the Council. And the reason for which you did not support a draft today is banal and very simple. You simply wish to maintain your leeway to use outer space for military purposes and to place there in outer space any forms of weapons. The so-called explanation from the U.S. representative before the vote, I do apologize, but it is laughable, and it does not withstand any criticism. He failed to respond to the main question. The United States wanted to prevent the placement of weapons of mass destruction in outer space. That is included in our text, and it was replicated, it was taken from your draft resolution, that of the United States and Japan. Please explain, why can you not accept a ban, a prohibition on the placement of all other forms of weapons in outer space? And for the rest of you, please, for the rest of you who voted against our draft, essentially, you didn't have anything to add to the conversation today. Distinguished colleagues, we call upon all of you to consider the consequences that residents of Earth would face in the event of militarization of outer space. And the likelihood, the probability of this scenario, as the United States once again and allies once again demonstrated, is unfortunately the likelihood of this is becoming all the more real. We did not conceal, we do not conceal that the conduct by Western countries of active militarization and exploration of space is something which is of deep concern to us. Suffice it to read the regularly published reports from their specialized agencies, and these reports name these actions and call them self-defense, and they are underpinned with generous premises. And at the same time, nobody other than the United States and their allies proclaimed outer space a theater for military action, nor they're placing their offensive combat systems and military systems there. Today, we have heard from Western countries a great deal of hypocritical words and characterizing both the draft resolution as well as our intentions, as well as blatant lies about the working methods of work on the draft resolution, where we held consultations, we gathered written comments, and we repeatedly extended silence at the request of delegations. At the same time, through today's vote was a defeat for all of those who, like the Russian Federation, are trying to avoid a confrontation leading to a conflict in near space orbit. Of course, the situation which has unfolded will require analysis and steps undertaken by our side. At the same time, the Russian Federation will remain committed to our obligations in outer space pursuant to international law. And incidentally, this is something which the U.S. representative rightly referred to. We repeatedly reaffirmed and continue to reaffirm our obligations. Despite the aggressive stance of the U.S. and allies, we will continue to work proactively along these lines, and we will spare no effort alongside relevant UN member states to keep space peaceful. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. President, outer space, a global public domain, has a bearing on the security and well-being of all humanity. Ensuring the peaceful attributes of outer space and promoting cooperation in outer space is the universal pursuit of the international community, as well as the shared responsibility of all member states. 60 years ago, the development and use of outer space began. Since then, the international community has been striving to improve the system of outer space governance. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty, OST for short, the first international treaty relating to outer space establishes the important principles of peaceful use, free exploration, and international cooperation, while categorically prohibiting the deployment of WMDs in outer space, thus contributing in an important way to the maintenance of peace, security, and sustainability of outer space. Meanwhile, with the advancement of space technology, some new threats and challenges have emerged in outer space. A certain country has defined outer space as a, quote, war-fighting domain, unquote, accelerated the build-up of its space force and deploying anti-missile systems and offensive weapons in outer space. Though not explicitly prohibited by the OST, such acts exacerbate risks of conflicts in outer space, clearly violate the principle of peaceful use of outer space established by the treaty, and go counter against the international community's goal of upholding security in outer space and advancing the cause of its peaceful use. Given above-mentioned context, the General Assembly has adopted annually by an overwhelming majority a resolution calling on the CD to negotiate and conclude a treaty on arms control in outer space and to explicitly prohibit the placement of weapons of any kind in outer space, so as to provide a fundamental institutional guarantee for the maintenance of outer space security. This represents the mainstream voice of the international community in promoting the governance of outer space, and the CD has been engaged in ongoing and in-depth discussions on this issue. President, China is of the view that the Security Council can, pursuant to its own mandate, consider the issue of outer space security in an appropriate manner. But in doing so, it is important to reflect on the consensus of the international community to the greatest extent possible, with the objective of promoting mutual trust and cooperation among all parties on the issue of outer space, while supporting and complementing the relevant discussions taking place in specialized fora. Last month, the Security Council failed to adopt the draft resolution on outer space security proposed by the United States and Japan. Since then, Russia has put forward a new draft resolution. This draft resolution recognizes the role and contribution of the OST while addressing the gaps contained therein by explicitly prohibiting the placement of weapons of any type in outer space and calling for the early conclusion of a treaty on arms control in outer space. These elements have received support from more than two-thirds of UN member states at the General Assembly, hence capturing the widespread concerns and voices of the international community, the developing countries in particular. China supported and co-sponsored the draft resolution tabled by Russia. However, due to differences in the positions, the draft resolution was not adopted in the vote we just had. China finds this deeply regrettable. President. The recent voting results at the Security Council on the two draft resolutions on outer space security indicate that parties still have different understandings and views on this issue. It will take some long-term efforts to build consensus. When it comes to the governance of the space, much remains to be done. The international community should uphold the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security, continuously strengthen dialogue, enhance mutual trust and deepen cooperation so as to turn outer space into a new frontier of durable security and common development. China is ready to continue to work with the international community to make positive efforts and contributions to the maintenance of outer space security and the promotion of its peaceful use. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. There are no more names on the list of speakers. This meeting stands adjourned. The 9,631st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Egypt and Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the provisional rules of procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with the Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Ms. Edem Wosornu, Director of Operations and Advocacy, Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tor Wennesland. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Security Council. Thank you for inviting me to address the Council on recent developments in Rafah, where the situation is becoming increasingly desperate and dangerous for the already besieged population. Regrettably, we face yet another of further catastrophe in Gaza amid stalled talks between the parties to secure the release of all hostages held in Gaza and a ceasefire to provide much-needed relief to the civilian population. Just 2 weeks ago, negotiations were ongoing in Cairo with the support of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. However, these talks ended on 9 May without agreement. I urge the parties to redouble all efforts and return to the negotiating table immediately and in good faith. I reiterate the UN's full support for the tireless efforts by the mediators to achieve this goal, and we stand ready to support implementation of such a deal. If talks do not resume, I fear for the worst for the beleaguered and terrified civilians in Rafah, for the hostages held in unimaginable conditions for more than 225 days, and for an overstretched humanitarian operation that remains on the brink inside the Strip. Mr. President, my colleague from OCHA will brief in greater details on the dire humanitarian situation in and around Rafah momentarily, but allow me to highlight some critical observations from the ground. Since the first week of May, the security situation in Rafah is rapidly worsening as the IDF operations and military maneuvers in and around the city have intensified. On May 5, Hamas launched mortars and rockets at IDF soldiers massed on the Israeli side of Kerem Shalom crossing, killing 4 IDF soldiers and wounding 10. IDF tanks shelling and series of airstrikes in Rafah killed at least 19 Palestinians on the same day, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza. The following day, the IDF said that it would prepare to operate with extreme force against Hamas in eastern Rafah and ordered approximately 100,000 Palestinians to immediately evacuate to what is described as an, quote, expanded humanitarian area in Al-Mawasi, unquote. Since operations began, more than 800,000 people have been displaced from Rafah to Mawasi, Khan Yunis, and Deir Bala amid daily IDF airstrikes in Rafah, killing dozens of Palestinians. Hamas has continued to fire rockets indiscriminately from Gaza towards Israel. These events have had a significant impact on humanitarian operations and access. The so-called expanded humanitarian area in Al-Mawasi lacks adequate shelter, food, water, and sewage infrastructure, and crossings for the entry of humanitarian goods have already been directly affected. In the wake of the Hamas strike on 6 May, Israeli authorities closed Kerem Shalom crossing for 3 days. The following day, the IDF said it had established an operational control in the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing and closed the crossing for the movement of goods and people. The Rafah crossing with Egypt remained closed. In addition, active hostilities and IDF operations continue to render nowhere safe in Gaza, including for humanitarian workers. Just last week, a staff member of the UN Department of Safety and Security from India died, and another staff member was seriously injured when the UN vehicle was struck as they traveled to the European hospital in Rafah governorate. This brings to a total 193 UN staffers who have been killed in Gaza since the start of the hostilities. Humanitarian movements must be made safer. Mr. President, I'm deeply concerned that the current trajectory, including the possibility of a larger scale operations, will further undermine efforts to scale up the entry of humanitarian goods and their safe distribution to desperate civilians. The opening of the Sikkim or Erez West crossing in Gaza North including for the entry of humanitarian relief items arriving via Ashdod and from Jordan, is a welcome development, as is the entry of the first time of humanitarian supplies through Cyprus via the US-built floating pier on 18 May. However, I reiterate that more aid is needed to meet the enormous scale of needs in Gaza, and there is no substitute for the full and increased operation of existing land crossings. The UN continued to engage with all concerned parties, including the Israeli authorities, to address these and other safety concerns, including an improved humanitarian notification system. Mr. President, the Secretary-General, alongside numerous international partners and concerned neighbors, including Egypt, have voiced serious objections to a military operation in the city of Rafah amid clear indications of its devastating consequences for the civilian population. Saving lives and addressing the critical needs in Rafah and Gaza more broadly must remain our immediate priority, and I reiterate the Secretary-General's call for a humanitarian ceasefire. At the same time, we must not lose sight of the risk that these immediate threats pose to the prospects for a resolution of this conflict and for the longer-term peace and stability in the region. I'm very concerned that the failure to reach a ceasefire in Gaza and a large-scale military operation in Rafah exacerbated the risk of escalating regional tensions. Since the start of hostilities on 7 October, I have engaged continuously in the region, including in Lebanon, to avert a wider spillover, and I, in support of the Secretary-General, will continue these efforts. I also reiterate that there can be no long-term solution in Gaza that is not fundamentally political. The new Palestinian government, with 8 ministers from Gaza, represent an important opportunity to support tangible steps toward unifying Gaza and the occupied West Bank politically, economically, and administratively. The international community should provide support to the new government to address its fiscal challenges, strengthen its governance capacity, and prepare it to reassume its responsibility in Gaza and, ultimately, govern the whole of the occupied Palestinian territory. The Palestinian Authority must also be an integral part of planning for Gaza recovery and construction. The devastation and misery of the past 7 months have reinforced a simple truth. Palestinians and Israelis can no longer wait to establish a viable political horizon to end the conflict and establish a two-state solution. Day after day, we are witnessing the deadly consequences of inaction. Now is the time to lay the foundations for a better future for Palestinians, Israelis, and the broader region. The UN will continue to support all such efforts. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Wennesland for his important briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Edem Wosornu.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Security Council. Thank you for this opportunity to brief you on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which has only grown from more urgent amid ongoing Israeli ground operations in and around Rafah since 6 May. To be frank, we are running out of words to describe what is happening in Gaza. We have described it as a catastrophe, a nightmare, as hell on earth. It is all of these and worse. And living conditions continue to deteriorate as a result of heavy fighting, particularly in Jabalia and eastern Rafah, as well as Israeli bombardment from air, land, and sea. The number of casualties continues to increase by the day. According to the Gaza Ministry of Health, more than 35,000 people have now been killed in the violence and more than 79,000 injured.
Around 17,000 children are unaccompanied or remain separated from their families. Let me note here also the Israeli military announcement last week that it had recovered the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages from Gaza. It is estimated that 128 Israeli and foreign nationals remain captive in Gaza, including fatalities whose bodies are withheld. And as you know, the extreme levels of violence have not spared the UN and humanitarian community. Special Coordinator has just updated on the death of our UN colleague on the 13th of May. Yet another UN staff member was killed and another seriously injured when their UN vehicle came under attack while en route to the European Gaza hospital in Khan Yunis. We lost a father, a husband, and a dedicated colleague with a distinguished career. This brings the number of UN staff killed in Gaza since the escalation of hostilities, again, as has been said, to 193 staff. We find it impossible to accept that people endeavoring to save lives are instead losing their lives, particularly as 1.1 million people face catastrophic levels of hunger and Gaza remains on the brink of famine. As of 18 May, just 10 bakeries are operational out of a total of 16 being supported by our humanitarian partners. However, it is expected that these will run out of stock and fuel within days if no additional supplies are received. The other 6 bakeries, all of which are in southern Gaza, have been forced to cease operation due to either shortages of fuel or because of ongoing hostilities. The healthcare system in Gaza is also under impossible strain. In Rafah, 21 medical points, 4 primary healthcare centers, and 4 hospitals are now inaccessible. In the north, 2 hospitals, 5 primary health care centers, and 16 medical points are inaccessible. These facilities all provided critical medical services, including trauma care, non-communicable disease management, kidney dialysis, and maternal and child health care. An estimated 14,000 critical patients currently require medical evacuation out of Gaza. Prior to the closure of the Rafah crossing, medical evacuations had reached approximately 50 patients per day. This means nearly 700 patients have not been evacuated since the closure of the Rafah crossing. Mr. President, since October 2023, 75% of the population in Gaza, 1.7 million people, have been forcibly displaced within Gaza, many of them up to 4 or 5 times, including as a result of repeated IDF-issued evacuation instructions. Some reports have also suggested that many thousands of Gazans may have crossed into Egypt and more are trying. And in the past 2 weeks, more than 800,000 people have been displaced from Rafah into other areas of Gaza in search of safety. As the conflict persists and lives are threatened, civilians must be allowed to seek protection. I must also emphasize unequivocally that persons forcibly displaced within or from Gaza must be guaranteed the right to voluntarily return as international law demands. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, today the once overcrowded camps and emergency shelters in Rafah have now largely emptied, with the majority of the displaced seeking refuge in Khan Yunis and Deir Abballah. But the situation that people are finding on their arrival at new sites in these areas is horrendous. There is exceedingly limited existing infrastructure. They lack adequate latrines, water points, drainage, and shelter. Civilians' essential needs must be met. For evacuated civilians, this means ensuring, to the greatest practicable extent, proper shelter and satisfactory minimum conditions of hygiene, health, safety, and nutrition, and that members of the same family are not separated. These appalling conditions leave serious doubt as to compliance with these basic obligations. Mr. President, the Rafah ground incursion is magnifying the impediments to an already fragile and beleaguered aid operation, as again has been said. As of 17 May, the Rafah crossing remains closed and inaccessible for humanitarian cargo, fuel, and personnel movement. This has prevented the entry of 82,000 metric tons of supplies, including critical food items and medicines. Around 654,000 liters of fuel have entered the Strip since the Rafah operation began on the 6th of May. This means on average, we are receiving just 1/4 of the fuel allocations that we had prior to 6th of May, further impacting the functioning of bakeries, hospitals, water wells, and other critical infrastructure. The crossing at Kerem Shalom, which has been the main entry point for critical aid, remains open in principle, but extremely difficult for aid organizations to access from the Gaza side due to hostilities, challenging logistical conditions, and complex coordination procedures. Among the northern northern land routes, Erez crossing, opened from 1st to 9th May, has been closed since. The newly opened Erez West, known as Siafa or Zikim, is now being used for limited quantities of aid, but now areas in the vicinity of this crossing are also under evacuation orders. We welcome the first aid shipment delivered on 17 May via the floating dock set up by the United States. The maritime corridor, hosted by Cyprus in line with Resolution 2720, and with support from other member states, is an important adjunct to a comprehensive humanitarian operation in Gaza. But as we have stressed, land routes remain the most viable and effective way to deliver the scale of aid needed. Mr. President, the United Nations and our partners are committed to staying and delivering in Gaza wherever civilians are in need, and we are configuring our operations to recent population movements. The United Nations Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator is in active engagement with relative parties to accelerate the provision of humanitarian relief consignments to Gaza through all possible routes. However, due to the current closure of the Rafah crossing and limited access via Kerem Shalom and other crossings, right now we lack the supplies and fuel to provide any meaningful level of support. I can take you and the Council members through the list of things we need. You have heard them before. 1, the toll of death, injury, destruction in Gaza is utterly unconscionable. We demand the civilians, their housing, and the vital infrastructure they depend on be protected as international humanitarian law requires. All feasible precautions must be taken to avoid and minimize civilian harm. 2, we need the facilitation of rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief into and within Gaza, also as a matter of international humanitarian law. All available access points must be open and kept open for a sustained period to allow aid to enter at scale. 3, we also need to be assured of the protection of humanitarian and UN staff, all of whom are working under extreme conditions in Gaza. This requires the parties to take constant care throughout military operations, which the agreed humanitarian notification system aims to maximize. It also requires enabling a stable communications network. 4, we need adequate funding, particularly for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the central pillar of our aid operation. As of 20 May, the 2024 flash appeal is only 25% funded. We urge donors to step forward with the funding received. we are grateful for the funding already received. But in all honesty, Mr. President, members of the Council, at this stage, and as has been said, it is only a humanitarian ceasefire and a halt in the ground incursion in Rafah that will fully protect civilians, create the conditions for humanitarians to work, to provide assistance at the scale required, and stem the endlessly deepening toll of this travesty in Gaza. So, our principal call today is for all parties, as a matter of urgency, to make genuine progress towards ceasefire, for the release of all remaining hostages, and for the Security Council and all member states to use their influence to bring this humanitarian catastrophe to an end. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Wosornu for our important briefing. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, I extend my sincere gratitude for convening this crucial meeting. My thanks also go to Mr. Winesland and Madame Wosornu for their insightful briefings. Mr. President, our deliberation today intervene at a critical juncture when 1.5 million Palestinians in Rafah face a looming death. Rafah is the last remaining area in Gaza that has not been completely destroyed. Rafah is the sole region where humanitarian actors could still operate. Rafah is now the final refuge for Gazans displaced from their homes. Rafah is the only place capable of hosting those rendered homeless, as all other regions lie in ruins. Rafah also hosts 3 of the last partially functional hospitals in Gaza. Rafah is a city of children where more than 600,000 have found refuge. Now faces unimaginable suffering and horror. Rafah is also adjacent to one of the main lifelines to transit aid to Gaza. By planning and launching the military operation in Rafah, the Israeli occupying power is executing a strategy of ethnic cleansing, killing Gaza's children and extinguishing the hope for a better life. The Israeli military operation have already started. This operation have already uprooted more than 800,000 people, nearly all of whom have been displaced multiple times in just over a week. This is the darkest moment in the 7th-month nightmare, as started by the UN. This operation will have grave consequences for the peace and the stability of the entire region. We urge the Council to act. It is not a time for mere discourse. It's time for decisive actions, such as a genocidal operation would lead to further breaches of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. I would entail further atrocity crimes for which those responsible must be held accountable. We call for an end to forced relocation and the protection of vital infrastructure on which these children rely. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is beyond catastrophic. I would like to share the testimony of Yasmina Gauda, who recently returned to Gaza for a second deployment with OCHA, and I quote, "We would need to invent brand new words to adequately describe the situation that Palestinians in Gaza find themselves in today. No matter where you look, no matter where you go, there is destruction, there is devastation, there is loss. There is a lack of everything. There is pain. There is a just, incredible suffering. People are living on top of the rubble and the waste that used to be their lives. They are hungry. Everything has become absolutely unaffordable. Access to clean water is a daily battle. Many people haven't been able to change clothes in 7 months because they just have to fly with whatever they were wearing. They were given 10 minutes notice and they had to run away. Many have been displaced 6, 7, 8 times or more. End of quote. Mr. President, the occupying power now control all crossing points, including the Rafah crossing, pushing the population to unprecedented levels of deprivation. Today, literally no humanitarian aid enters Gaza. There is almost nothing left to distribute in Gaza. Despite declaring the mechanism of humanitarian aid established by Resolution 2720, finally operation through Jordanian and maritime corridors, the situation remained unchanged. The aid convoy coming from Jordan, which was supposed to be protected by the occupying forces, has been attacked by Israeli settlers. Its contents unloaded, burned, and destroyed in total impunity and under the protection of occupying forces. According to OCHA, only 33 trucks have successfully entered Gaza between May 10th and 7th, 2024. We salute the effort to explore different routes to ensure humanitarian aid reaches civilian population in Gaza. However, land routes are indispensable. All crossing points should be reopened without any further delay. Mr. President, what we are witnessing in Gaza is not a war. It's a genocide, a barbaric behavior born out of someone feeling totally immune to face the consequences. Given the prevailing climate of impunity, it is a high time for the international community, for this very Security Council, that to halt the hostility and establish an international inquiry mission to establish facts and ensure accountability. The children of Gaza, the women of Gaza, the people of Gaza deserve justice and the support of the international community. Inaction means abandoning them. Abandoning them means abdicating our humanity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. On 13th of October, the first evacuation order was issued in Gaza. We saw haunting photos and videos of people packing their lives and leaving the north in long lines of cars, buses, animal-drawn carriages, or even just on foot, supposedly to safe areas. This was followed by a number of evacuation orders to new safe areas, over and over again. People fled to Deir al-Balah, to Khan Yunis, to Al-Mawasi, to Rafah. 1.7 million people fled. Many fled multiple times, 4 or 5 times we heard today, in search of safety and security. Thousands of them never reached safe areas. We condemn this loss of civilian lives. Colleagues, some of us have been calling for ceasefire for months. On 25th March, we finally collectively adopted Resolution 2728, demanding a ceasefire. This resolution was not respected by Hamas and neither by Israel. For the past few weeks, we have all been united in rejecting the prospect of a military operation in Rafah. Our calls are being ignored. Briefing after briefing, we are being told that there is no safe way to conduct a military operation in Rafah without killing civilians and causing huge human suffering. We are therefore deeply disturbed that calls by all Security Council members, on top of calls from global public and on top of ICJ order, are being ignored by Israeli leaders. And so we were confronted by new evacuation orders and the announcement of Israel of the intensification of the operation in this last safe resort in Gaza. Slovenia condemned the start of the operation, and we continue believing this operation must stop immediately. We are alarmed by the situation in which Gazan civilians are finding themselves in again, particularly women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons. We reiterate that there is no military solution to the security of Israel. We are concerned about the daily exacerbation of the already catastrophic humanitarian situation and the full-blown famine moving from the north to the south. Obstructions of humanitarian access persist, as well as the highly dangerous operational environment for humanitarian actors, including UNRWA, the backbone, the center pillar of humanitarian response in Gaza. This also includes closures and operational constraints at and attacks on vital crossings. We reject and condemn forced displacement. We repeat our call for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. The provisional orders of the ICJ and resolutions of the Security Council must be respected. We underline that evacuation orders do not absolve obligations under international humanitarian law. War crimes and crimes against humanity committed on the territory of Israel and Palestine from at least 7th October 2023 must be prosecuted independently and impartially, regardless of the perpetrators. Accountability is crucial to prevent atrocities and to guarantee peace. Colleagues, we wonder what is the future of this conflict. Young voices across the region and beyond are enraged and full of frustration. We are at risk of building an angry generation that will result in a loss of moderate voices in the region. Their dreams are being replaced by nightmares of violence and loss. We have been in this council for 5 months. If there is one lesson that we have learned, it is that it is a very powerful body, but only if united. For the sake of Palestinian civilians in Gaza and Israeli civilians taken hostage, the Council should return to searching for unity in order to stop the war, to return the hostages and feed starving Palestinians, so that they can all finally wake up from this man-made nightmare. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Special Coordinator Wensland and Director Wosornu of OCHA for their sobering briefings. For several months now, the members of this Council have collectively warned against any ground operation into Rafah, where 1.4 million people have been packed in a state of panic, devastation, hunger, and instability. In spite of these repeated strong voices, Israel is now expanding its operation into Rafah. As a friendly country to Israel, the Republic of Korea calls on Israel to immediately suspend its operation in Rafah. These deadly operations are pushing innocent Palestinian civilians to the verge of further devastation and displacement. They may also be putting the Israeli hostages held by Hamas and other groups in additional danger. Noting the disturbing reports of mass graves at the ruins of Nasser and Al-Shifa hospitals, as well as pending evacuation orders for the remaining functional hospitals in Rafah. We are deeply concerned about the possible fate of these hospitals in Rafah and their patients who are now arriving in even greater numbers due to hostilities. The Republic of Korea has repeatedly condemned the terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October and reiterated that Israel has a right and duty to protect its citizens. However, as this conflict has lasted for more than half a year, over 35,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed, many of whom are women and children, and the entire world has been appealing for an end to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of this conflict. The resolutions adopted by this Council stress the protection of civilians in accordance with international law. Unfortunately, however, these demands have not been adequately heeded by the parties. The current operations in Rafah by the IDF are even more alarming, as no substantial operation plans to protect the civilians are in place. Nearly 800,000 civilians have been forced to flee Rafah since May 6 alone. Without any adequate protection nor any plan, many are returning to north to completely destroyed areas without water and lacking sanitations that are also subject to bombardment, further underscoring that no place is safe in Gaza. Israel says that the final goal of the IDF is eliminating Hamas. However, this bloody offensive in Rafah will only fan the flames of additional extremism, endanger the safe release of hostages, further jeopardize Israel's long-term security in the region, and undercut prospects for lasting peace. This vicious cycle must end at the earliest possible juncture. The Republic of Korea once again demands an immediate ceasefire throughout Gaza, including Rafah, the release of all remaining hostages held by Hamas and the other groups, as well as the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale. With the UN saying that famine is imminent in Gaza, we are particularly concerned that both Israeli operations in Rafah, including the complete closing of Rafah crossing, and Hamas attack against IDF are seriously hindering the delivery of life-saving assistance into Gaza Strip. All available crossings into Gaza must be immediately reopened and fully operated to save lives. We welcome the operationalization of the humanitarian mechanism under Resolution 2720 and hope that this will contribute to expanding humanitarian aid throughout Gaza. We once again urge the parties to this conflict to prioritize the sufferings of innocent civilians and hostages ahead of other considerations, and accept the terms of the negotiations on the table to achieve the release of hostages and a desperately needed ceasefire. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and OSHA Director Edem Wosornu for their briefings. I want to begin by reiterating Malta's condemnation of the terrorist attacks on 7th October and Hamas's continued holding of hostages. We reiterate our call for their immediate and unconditional release. Malta is gravely concerned at the expanding Israeli military offensive into Rafah. In line with concerns raised by the international community, including UN bodies and humanitarian agencies, we categorically reject Israel's ongoing offensive. For months, Rafah has housed 1.5 million internally displaced Palestinians, many of whom are vulnerable women and children. Over 600,000 civilians have been forced to flee Rafah, forcibly displaced once more due to the escalated attacks in the past days. These are civilians who have endured the worst forms of suffering for months. They are physically and psychologically exhausted, malnutritioned, malnourished, and on the verge of famine. They are entirely desperate. The protection of civilians remains paramount. A continued and expanded offensive into Rafah will only compound the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. Efforts to address the humanitarian crisis also continue to be hampered. The Rafah crossing is a main entry point for the aid into Gaza. Its seizure and closure by Israel has severely compromised the provisions and distribution of aid and the maintenance of essential infrastructure and services, including hospitals, bakeries, water, and sanitation facilities. The denial of food, fuel, medicine, and life-saving essentials to a besieged population has been ongoing since the beginning of this war and is completely unconscionable. Israel has an obligation to facilitate unimpeded aid through all available routes and border crossings to and across Gaza Strip, in line with international humanitarian law. The Rafah crossing must be reopened immediately, and the necessary measures taken to ensure scaled-up, unimpeded humanitarian access into and throughout Gaza. The completion of the floating dock off Gaza's shore is an encouraging development, and we commend the United States' efforts in this regard. Nonetheless, we underline the importance of land routes, which remain the most viable and effective modes of delivery of aid. Furthermore, last week's killing of a UNDP staff member following a strike on their UN-marked vehicle further illustrates the need to ensure the necessary protections for UN, medical, and humanitarian workers. Abidance with deconfliction mechanisms is key. We condemn all such attacks and call for thorough, independent, and urgent investigations into all cases. President, Malta remains deeply concerned that relevant Security Council resolutions are being completely disregarded by the conflict parties. We call for their full implementation. Moreover, the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice of 26 January and 28 March must be fully complied with. Accountability for any violation of international law is equally imperative. Amid escalations in Rafah, as well as renewed and intensified fighting in the north of Gaza, Malta reiterates its call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire of this conflict. The immediate term priorities must be the immediate term priorities must be de-escalation, diplomacy, and the prioritization of civilian lives. Peace is not optional and demands to be steered by a recognition of our common humanity. This will also allow the space to bolster all our efforts for a renewed and holistic political horizon. This must include a realization of a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states, living side by side, in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Let me start by thanking Special Coordinator Wennesland and Ms. Wosornu for their briefing today. And I'd like to express our deepest condolences once again for the loss of UN staff who've been killed in this conflict. President, I will make 3 broad points. First, it has now been over 7 months since the dreadful terror attacks of 7 October. Hostages are still being held, and our thoughts are with them and the families who continue to suffer without knowledge of the safety and well-being of their loved ones. The situation in Gaza is desperate, and the toll on civilians continues to grow. Too many Palestinian civilians have been killed, and there is an urgent need to get more aid to the people of Gaza to prevent a famine. The UK is clear that we would not support an expanded operation in Rafah unless there is a very clear plan for how to protect people and save lives. We have not seen that plan. So, in these circumstances, we would not support an expanded operation in Rafah. Second, we welcome the news that the Cyprus Maritime Aid Corridor to Gaza is operational. Aid from the UK and other nations is now making its way via that route to the Gazan people. But this is not enough. We urge Israel to let humanitarian aid enter Gaza through all crossings, including by reopening Rafah, and Israel must fulfill its commitments to increase aid and guarantee deconfliction for aid convoys and other humanitarian work. We have seen appalling attacks on aid convoys and UN offices by Israeli extremists, and the tragic deaths of UN and other humanitarian personnel in Gaza. We condemn all attacks on aid workers and support the UN's call for an independent investigation. Finally, the fastest way to end this conflict is to secure a deal which gets the hostages out and allows for a pause in the fighting. We must then work to turn that pause into a sustainable, permanent ceasefire. We must remove Hamas's capacity to launch attacks at Israel and end their control of Gaza to ensure lasting peace. We must also provide steadfast support to the new Palestinian government as they implement much-needed reforms. And in order to secure a political horizon for the Palestinian people with a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France. You have the floor.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie M. Tor Wendland et Mme Edem Wosornu pour leurs exposés. La France est profondément préoccupée par la situation à Rafah qui continue de s'aggraver. J'aurai trois messages aujourd'hui. Comme l'a exprimé à plusieurs reprises le président de la République Emmanuel Macron au Premier ministre Netanyahu, la France est fermement opposée à l'offensive israélienne sur Rafah. Elle ne ferait qu'aggraver une situation déjà catastrophique à Gaza et augmenter les risques d'escalade. Elle rappelle que le transfert forcé de population constitue un crime de guerre au sens du droit international et que l'avenir de Gaza ne peut se jouer que dans le cadre d'un futur État palestinien et sous la responsabilité de l'autorité palestinienne. La France, aux côtés de 12 autres pays, a réitéré le 16 mai, je cite, son opposition à une opération militaire à grande échelle à Rafah qui aurait des conséquences catastrophiques sur la population civile déjà déplacée à plusieurs reprises. Les civils ne disposent d'aucune zone sûre aujourd'hui à Gaza. L'opération israélienne a entraîné la mort d'un agent des Nations Unies lundi qui circulait dans un véhicule qui portait l'emblème de l'organisation en violation du droit international humanitaire. La fermeture du point de passage de Rafah a de graves conséquences sur les populations civiles, alors que les quantités d'aide qui entrent à Gaza depuis le début du conflit sont extrêmement insuffisantes. La situation humanitaire et sanitaire est insoutenable et la France appelle Israël à rouvrir le point de passage de Rafah vers l'Égypte, qui est indispensable tant pour l'accès de l'aide humanitaire à la population civile que pour permettre aux personnes les plus vulnérables de quitter la bande de Gaza. Elle appelle plus largement à rouvrir tous les points de passage nécessaires. La France appelle de nouveau Israël à tout mettre en œuvre pour assurer la protection des civils et des personnels humanitaires et à garantir l'accès de l'aide humanitaire conformément au droit international, conformément aux demandes de la Cour internationale de justice. Monsieur le Président, sur le plan politique, enfin, la France continuera de s'engager dans la voie d'une sortie de crise rapide qui soit fondée sur la solution à deux États. Il faut des garanties de sécurité pour les Israéliens, auxquelles la France réitère sa solidarité à la suite des attaques terroristes barbares qui ont été commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre et qu'on condamne dans les termes les plus forts. Il faut travailler à l'édification d'un État pour les Palestiniens. L'autorité palestinienne a un rôle central à jouer dans ce processus, en Cisjordanie comme à Gaza, qui a bien entendu vocation à faire partie de cet État palestinien. Et pour cela, il faut un cadre politique et les Nations Unies auront un rôle essentiel. La France a proposé au Conseil de sécurité un projet de résolution qui permettra d'avancer en ce sens. Et elle poursuivra ses consultations avec le Conseil de sécurité et ses partenaires dans la région à ce sujet. Ce projet de résolution demande notamment l'arrêt de l'offensive à Rafah, objectif qui, je le crois, est partagé par tout notre Conseil, qui est l'objet de notre discussion d'aujourd'hui. Et nous appelons donc tous les membres à soutenir ce projet. Dans les éléments Parlement, tant sur la situation humanitaire que sur le volet politique, peuvent faire l'objet d'un consensus. Je vous remercie.
I thank France for their statement. I now give the floor to Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais aussi remercier chaleureusement le coordinateur Torven-Estland et la directrice d'OCHA, Edem Wosornu, de leur présentation qui souligne encore et encore l'urgence de la situation. La Suisse réitère son appel à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et à l'arrêt de l'opération militaire en cours à Rafah à laquelle nous nous opposons. Les conséquences de cette opération pour une population civile en proie depuis plus de 7 mois aux bombardements, aux déplacements répétés et à la famine sont inacceptables. Cette population a aujourd'hui besoin d'assistance et non de nouvelles souffrance. Depuis l'adoption de la résolution 1265 sur la protection des civils, il y a 25 ans, les résolutions de ce Conseil se sont succédées pour condamner et mettre fin aux attaques délibérées contre les civils, y compris les actes de terreur, les prises d'otages et les violences à caractère sexuel ou basées sur le genre. Les actes de terreur et la prise d'otages perpétrés par le Hamas le 7 octobre en Israël, que la Suisse a fermement condamné, ont violé l'ensemble de ces résolutions. Les récits des survivantes et survivants de ces attaques, notamment des otages ainsi que leurs proches, témoignent de la violence dont ils ont fait l'objet. Ces actes ont laissé chez eux une trace indélébile. La Suisse continue d'appeler à la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle des otages. Depuis le 7 octobre, la Suisse a contribué activement à l'adoption de 3 résolutions, 27-12, 27-20 et 27-28. Ces résolutions ont toutes appelé à la protection des civils, notamment à travers le ferme rejet des attaques délibérées contre les civils et les objets civils qui sont protégés par le droit international, l'appel à la libération des otages, le rappel de l'obligation de fournir aux organismes humanitaires un accès complet, sûr, rapide et sans entrave aux civils, y compris aux personnes déplacées, ainsi que la réitération du devoir d'assurer la sécurité, la protection et la liberté de mouvement du personnel des organismes humanitaires, en particulier de l'ONU. Force est de constater que ces exigences n'ont pas été mises en œuvre. La Suisse condamne le fait que les otages n'ont pas encore été libérés, que les hostilités continuent de faire de nombreuses victimes parmi les civils et de forcer le déplacement de centaines de milliers d'entre eux, dont de nombreux enfants, dans des conditions de détresse épouvantables. La Suisse salue les efforts qui ont mené à la mise en place d'une option de fourniture d'aide humanitaire par voie maritime. Cependant, l'aide humanitaire entrant à Gaza reste largement insuffisante, comme l'a répété Mme Edem Wosornu aujourd'hui. Toutes les parties, y compris les États tiers, doivent s'acquitter de leurs obligations de fournir l'accès humanitaire dans l'ensemble de la bande de Gaza et par toutes les voies possibles. Le décès récent d'un énième représentant de l'ONU, et j'aimerais présenter mes condoléances sincères à la famille, nous rappelle que le personnel humanitaire doit bénéficier de la protection et de la liberté de circulation nécessaires à l'accomplissement de ses tâches. Les obstacles à son travail sont un problème récurrent dans les conflits armés et la Suisse compte sur le soutien de tous les membres du Conseil sur le projet de résolution qu'elle a préparé à cet effet. Monsieur le Président, cette tragédie n'a que trop duré. La Suisse appelle à la mise en œuvre sans plus tarder des résolutions de ce Conseil, y compris les résolutions 2334, 2712, 2720 et surtout aussi 2728, qui sont contraignantes et exigent le respect du droit international, y compris du droit international humanitaire et des droits humains. La Suisse est préoccupée par d'éventuels crimes de guerre, rappelle la compétence de la Cour pénale internationale, prend acte du fait que la Cour cherche à obtenir des mandats d'arrêt contre certains individus et soutient pleinement la Cour et souligne l'importance de respecter son indépendance. Puisse cette semaine spécialement dédiée à la protection des civils marquer une étape décisive vers la désescalade et un premier pas vers la mise en place d'une paix durable entre Israéliens et Palestiniens. Nous réitérons notre soutien ferme à la solution négociée à 2 États, Israël et Palestine, Palestine, dont Gaza fait partie intégrante, et vivant côte à côte en paix et en sécurité à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President.
I
thank Algeria and Slovenia for initiating today's meeting. I thank Special Coordinator Wenesland and Director Wosornu for their briefings. Over 220 days into the Gaza conflict, we've witnessed unprecedented civilian casualties, unprecedented infrastructure destruction, and unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Despite repeated calls from the international community for an immediate ceasefire and a clear demands, as expressed in the Security Council resolutions, Israel has chosen to turn a deaf ear. Facing strong opposition from the international community, Israel is still pushing ahead with its large-scale offensive on Rafah, once again driving hundreds of thousands of Gazans into displacement. China expresses its grave concern and strong opposition. Nothing can justify the perpetuation of conflict. The collective punishment of civilians does not create conditions conducive to the rescue of hostages. Israel must immediately cease its military operation in Rafah. China supports further Council action to ensure the implementation of Council Resolution 2728. We also hope that the United States, as the country with major influence on Israel, can uphold impartiality and effectively facilitate a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. The current humanitarian disaster in Gaza is inconceivable. The occupation of the Rafah border crossing has seriously hindered access for humanitarian aid.
导致人道物资准入严重受阻，从约旦向加沙运送的人道物资受到阻拦和破坏，人道工作者和联合国人员面临重重障碍，甚至生命危险。这样的情况不可接受。陆路运输是实现人道物资大规模准入的关键，没有任何其他方式可以替代。以色列应切实履行国际法和国际人道法义务，立即开放全部陆路过境点，确保食品、药品、燃料等基本生存物资供给。联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处在约旦河西岸设置，在约旦河西岸的设施遭到袭击，令人震惊。我们要求占领方对事件进行彻查和追责。主席，两国方案是解决巴以问题的唯一可行出路。中方支持巴勒斯坦独立建国，支持巴勒斯坦早日成为联合国正式会员国。加沙是巴勒斯坦不可分割的一部分。任何关于加沙战后治理的方案都应尊重巴勒斯坦人民的意愿，都应尊重地区国家的合理关切，都不能背离两国方案的基本方向。刚刚过去的5月15日是巴勒斯坦第76个灾难日，几十年来，一代代巴勒斯坦人为争取合法权利进行艰难的抗争。中国将继续同国际社会一道，做出不懈努力，推动加沙立即停火，缓解人道灾难，落实两国方案，让巴勒斯坦灾难日永远成为历史，实现巴以和平共处，中东长治久安。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting requested by Algeria and Slovenia. We thank Special Coordinator Tom Wennesland and Director Edem Wosornu for their briefing, which have emphasized the gravity of the situation in the Gaza Strip and the entire occupied territory. The conflict in the Gaza Strip continues to be increasingly catastrophic and deadly, with civilians paying the highest cost. We continue to be regularly updated by humanitarian workers, experts, and witnesses on the destructive nature of this conflict and the long-lasting impact it will have on survivors, especially children and young people, who are predisposed to anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other adverse mental health conditions. Since the 7 October 2023 attacks, which we continue to condemn, and with recent escalation in the north of the Gaza Strip and in Rafah, the Gaza Strip has been under constant bombardment, destruction of civilian properties and infrastructure, loss of lives, and shortage of essential goods and services. The deplorable sanitary and hygiene conditions are most concerning, noting the exposure to such conditions by women and children. Multiple forced displacement has also been a common theme since October last year. Humanitarian activities have become almost impossible as resources dwindle and access remains limited. This devastation could have been avoided and is still avoidable if the parties to the conflict respect their obligations under international law, particularly to protect civilians, respect and implement the resolutions of the Security Council and the provisional orders of the International Court of Justice binding on the parties. It is deeply concerning that all efforts to bring about cessation of hostilities, a peaceful settlement of the conflict, are proving to be futile. However, there should be persistent perseverance to pursue the cessation of hostilities, secure the release of hostages, and get unhindered humanitarian aid into Gaza. We must not relent, especially at this point when over 35,400 Palestinians killed and 79,400 wounded and 1.7 million displaced, the majority having been displaced multiple times, and over 100 Israeli civilians still be held as hostage. Despite the challenges that exist to get both parties to reach a compromise, the demands of this Council and the international community remain constant. In this regard, we emphasize the following three imperatives. Firstly, we repeat our call for a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and across the occupied Palestinian territory, Israel, and across the Blue Line. Incidents of crossfire via air, land, and sea cause deaths, increased suffering, destruction, and fear. We cannot be paralyzed witnesses to the calamitous deaths, destruction, and suffering. We must compel the parties to the conflict to respect international law, comply with their obligations, implement the fundamental principles of the law of war, and the important provisions of the Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728. Secondly, we call on the parties to the conflict, especially Israel, to create conditions that will allow for an effective humanitarian operation in the Gaza Strip. We know that despite the escalating humanitarian needs, challenges such as an unimpeded access via critical land routes to Kerem, Shalom, and Rafah, logistical hurdles, and seamless coordination with humanitarian agencies continue to disrupt operations. Thirdly, we condemn ongoing military operations in Rafah and the north of Gaza that has led to the displacement of over 800 civilians from Rafah. Attacks on UN premises, residential infrastructure, and refugee camps are deeply regrettable and unacceptable. We continue to reiterate the need and legal obligations for the immediate release of all hostages. Mr. President, today through a statement, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Mr. Kerem, has informed of applications for arrest warrants before the court's pre-trial Chamber 1 and the situation in the state of Palestine following, and I quote, an independent and impartial investigations, end of quote, by his office. In our pronounced support for accountability for violations of crimes of serious concern to the international community and end impunity for atrocity crimes, as well as being a state party to the Rome Statute of the ICC, we take note of the statement on the applications by Prosecutor Kerem and acknowledge that a judicial determination is to be made on the said applications. Let me close, Mr. President, by stressing the need for member states with influence to urge the parties to the conflict to pursue actions that will support ongoing diplomatic negotiations and for them to choose peace over war. Sierra Leone reiterates its commitment to this cause of peace until a just and lasting solution is achieved. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President,
благодарим
Венесланду и Wosornu for the overview of the situation on the occupied Palestinian territory. We are grateful to the delegation of Algeria and Slovenia for having convened today's meeting of the Security Council on the situation in the Gaza Strip, where for the 8th month now, the Israeli Defense Force operation has been ongoing. This has claimed the lives of more than 35,500 people. This is a staggering figure which is unparalleled in contemporary history. And although the humanitarian situation in the area of hostilities is unprecedented vis-à-vis the suffering endured by civilians, it is continuing to escalate with each passing day. We all are exceedingly concerned by the plans of Western Jerusalem to cleanse the city of Rafah to the south of the Palestinian enclave, where approximately 1.5 million civilians are sheltering. According to the conclusion of the General Commissioner of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, since the beginning of hostilities, 800,000 Palestinians were forced to flee Rafah, flee their homes, and the assertions of Israeli leadership that the population of Rafah have opportunities to move to a safe humanitarian zone are completely at odds with reality. When it comes to Gaza, there simply are no such safe zones. With each passing day, people are dying in the city. And the reports about the discovery of 7 mass graves in the cities of Gaza and Khan Yunis, with the bodies of more than 520 Palestinians have reverberated widely. We are awaiting the result of the independent investigation, which the Security Council demanded in connection with this in its press statement. We demand that Israel unstintingly comply with the provisions of international humanitarian law. We condemn attacks on UN personnel and humanitarian representatives working on the ground, and we support the relevant call of the Secretary General to conduct an independent international investigation into all instances of the deaths of those who are helping the Palestinians to survive. Mr. President, the Gaza Strip lacks stable channels for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Over the past 2 weeks, Tzahal has been blocking entry through the Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossing points for 3,000 trucks with humanitarian assistance for the residents of the Strip. As a result, a significant section of the population of Gaza, according to the assessments of specialized UN agencies, specifically the World Food Program, are on the brink of starvation. In parallel, Israeli air assets are directing strikes on the southern and central parts of the Gaza Strip. There is an ongoing siege of the Al-Auda hospital in the Jabalia refugee camp. As a result, the wounded and the ill are unable to receive the necessary care. Against the backdrop of military hostilities, civilian life is becoming all the more unbearable on the west bank of the Jordan River, where there are unabated clashes between Israeli troops and settlers and local residents. Mr. President, the developments in Gaza bear out the fact that at this juncture, prospects for the conflict being put on a political diplomatic track and the establishment of a ceasefire regime, which the Russian Federation has advocated from the very beginning of the escalation, continue to look elusive. We see that the current Israeli leadership is bent on pursuing military hostilities, despite the increasingly obvious inability to achieve all of the stated objectives of their operation. Unfortunately, such obstinacy threatens the lives of Israeli hostages too. With each passing day, the likelihood of relatives seeing their loved ones alive dims. At the same time, numerous rounds of talks between Israel and the Hamas movement through mediators on the question of exchange of Israeli hostages held for Palestinian detainees have not borne fruit. Under these circumstances, the international community needs to continue to deliver, to exert pressure both on Western Jerusalem and on its main ally, Washington, where on the 24th of April, another bill was signed for new deliveries of weapons throughout the entire world, including an allocation of assistance, military assistance to Israel to the tune of $26.4 billion. This is nearly 8 times more than the assistance allocated by Washington annually for that country. In this way, Israel will receive new bombs, new missiles to kill Palestinian civilians. This is reflective of how the U.S. cares about peace in the Middle East. This step, coupled with the suspension of financing for UNRWA, has been giving rise to growing discontent and outrage, even within the United States itself, where anti-Israeli protests have convulsed college campuses in major universities. The outrage of young people is understandable. Washington's position vis-à-vis UNRWA appears particularly cynical and divorced from reality, given that the group of experts led by Catherine Kalana not only reaffirmed the principle of neutrality, that UNRWA has complied with that principle of neutrality and confirmed the key role of the agency in the delivery of assistance to Palestinians, but she also observed that Israel has been unable to substantiate its allegations, and the blind support on the whole for its regional ally by the United States in and of itself is now a destabilizing factor. The Security Council of the United Nations has become paralyzed. In this context, the U.S. veto on the draft Security Council resolution with recommendation for the General Assembly to accept Palestinian membership was predictable. In this way, the United States not only blocked the attempt to redress a historic injustice vis-à-vis Palestinians and their fundamental right to self-determination, but the U.S. also betrayed their true position vis-à-vis the two-state solution, which underpins all Security Council resolutions and those of the General Assembly and the peace initiatives on the Palestinian problem. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. President. We also thank Special Coordinator Venesland and OCHA Director Wosornu for their sobering updates. It has been over 7 months of devastation, hostilities, and suffering since Hamas's heinous terror attack. Japan reiterates its unequivocal condemnation of the attack and its call for the immediate release of the hostages. As we meet, the situation on the ground in Rafah is rapidly worsening due to the continued and intensifying attacks and the destruction of buildings and infrastructure. We are also appalled to hear that more than 800,000 Palestinians have been forcibly redisplaced since the military operation in Rafah began, despite the international community's opposition. Many have fled mostly to Dir al-Bahla or Han Yunis, overcrowded areas with dire humanitarian conditions and little access to basic necessities, as we heard from OCHA briefer. What is more, the closure of the Rafah border crossing has led to a standoff that has prevented desperately needed aid from reaching the population. A full-blown famine has already gripped the north and is now imminent in the south as well. The crossing must be reopened at once. Japan welcomes that the maritime corridor through the pier built by the United States is now operational, yet this can be no substitute to the humanitarian aid through land route. We also welcome that the UN mechanism established in accordance with Resolution 2720 began its operations on May 7th. We urge all parties, particularly Israel, to continue constructive engagement with Ms. Sigrid Kaag for the acceleration of the delivery of humanitarian relief consignment to Gaza. For our part, Japan contributed to the recent opening of an ICRC field hospital in Rafah to help address overwhelming medical needs. We will continue to do whatever possible to save innocent lives. As the conflict drags on, we have witnessed an increase in the tragic loss of civilian lives, including brave aid workers. We mourn that more than 190 UN staff have now been killed since October 7th, including an international staff member of UNDSS recently shot in Rafah. UN personnel and humanitarian workers are there to help the population. They must be protected and allowed to safely carry out their duties. Mr. President, countless lives, including those of the hostages who remain in captivity, are at stake, and every hour worsens the plight of the people of Gaza. Now is the time to cease attacks and achieve an immediate ceasefire. Japan reiterates its opposition to the Israeli military ground operation in Rafah that involves heavy civilian casualties. We sincerely hope that the parties swiftly return to the negotiations facilitated by the US, Egypt, and Qatar to reach a substantive cessation of hostilities, and that will allow for a massive influx of aid at scale and the release of hostages. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President.
Empiezo por agradecer a las delegaciones de Argelia y Eslovenia por la convocatoria de esta reunión, así como al coordinador especial Wennesland y a la directora de la OCHA, Edem Wosornu, por sus informes. Reitero el apoyo de mi país a su imprescindible trabajo. Ha pasado poco más de una semana desde la última sesión del Consejo sobre este tema y la situación, por desgracia, es más difícil cada día. No se han concretado los acuerdos que parecían cercanos y que hubiesen permitido tanto el cese de las hostilidades como la liberación de los rehenes que aún están en manos de Hamas. Las operaciones militares se han expandido en el sur de la franja, especialmente en el este de Rafah. Las cifras de muertos y heridos se incrementan mientras más de 640.000 personas han huido de esa ciudad y se enfrentan a situaciones cada vez más precarias. El paso de Rafah se ha cerrado, y aunque el paso de Shalom esté operativo, las condiciones logísticas y de seguridad hacen imposible la entrega de ayuda humanitaria a gran escala. Esto evidentemente ha agravado una situación ya desesperada y desesperante. Colegas, hace 7 días, la Coordinadora Superior de Asuntos Humanitarios y de la Reconstrucción para Gaza, informó sobre la activación del mecanismo mandatado en la Resolución 2720. También, hace pocos días se conoció que se había finalizado la instalación de un muelle temporal para el ingreso de la ayuda a Gaza por vía marítima. Todos estos valiosos esfuerzos son, lamentablemente, insuficientes ante la ausencia de las condiciones de acuerdos que hagan posible un masivo incremento de la ayuda. El Ecuador recuerda que la implementación de todas las resoluciones de este Consejo, así como de las medidas provisionales de la Corte Internacional de Justicia, es obligatoria y necesaria para que la ayuda humanitaria llegue de forma segura, suficiente y oportuna a todas quienes lo necesitan. Es ineludible un alto al fuego inmediato, tal como este Consejo lo exigió en su resolución 2728. Es imperativo también It is also imperative to achieve the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages taken during the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October, which we once again condemn.
Ecuador
is grateful to those countries who continue to make efforts to mediate between the parties and reach the long-awaited agreement which will lead to a ceasefire, the delivery of aid, and the release of the hostages, and urges for continued efforts of this nature despite the difficulties. Finally, my country reiterates its conviction that the only way to end this conflict is through a peaceful, negotiated, definitive and just solution for all parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, upon the basis of 1967 borders and relevant resolutions. I thank you.
I thank Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana. You have the floor, Madam.
Mr. President, let me begin by expressing appreciation to Special Coordinator Wennesland and Director Wosornu for their briefing on the ongoing developments in the Gaza Strip, including Rafah. One would have thought that the catastrophe in Gaza could get no worse, but the occupying power continues to devise and execute increasingly horrendous punishments on innocent civilians in Gaza. All of this is taking place while the Strip is besieged, land routes locked off, and Israel rains bombs and bullets on innocent, defenseless people, including women and children. The humanitarian situation is beyond catastrophic, as we have heard from our briefers. With the key Rafah and Karen Abu Salem crossings blocked or ineffective because of the security situation, humanitarian operations are being crippled. Guyana calls on Israel to adhere to its legal obligations as an occupying power to ensure that the needs of the population are met and that supplies essential to its survival are provided. The International Court of Justice has clearly underlined Israel's obligation in this regard, but it continues to turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to the rule of law. After decimating Gaza, Israel is retracing its steps with fresh bombings from north to south. Quite cynically, it has urged civilians to evacuate to safe zones, but the question is repeatedly asked, which place in Gaza is safe? The answer is zero, none. An estimated 800,000 persons have been displaced from Rafah in a continuous cycle of bombing and displacement. The death toll is rising and is nearly 36,000. The number of persons injured is reaching 80,000. Guyana calls for an end to the Israeli operation in Gaza and for the hostilities to cease. We demand an immediate ceasefire. Mr. President, alarm bells are sounding incessantly in Gaza, and this Council must intervene now to stop the carnage. In this context, I wish to underscore three critical points. First, civilians in Gaza must be provided with the goods and services essential to their survival. Guyana has taken note of the projection of Under-Secretary General Griffiths that aid shortages could have apocalyptic consequences for Gaza. For months, the Council has been apprised of the various hindrances to aid delivery into Gaza and of what is needed to prevent famine and disease. 3 resolutions have been adopted, all emphasizing the need for the immediate, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. The humanitarian situation has, however, worsened, owing both to the unbearable security situation and the inadequacy of the humanitarian response. While acknowledging the efforts of those who have attempted to address this issue by other means, Guyana stresses that there is no substitute for land routes. We therefore call on the government of Israel to comply with its obligations under international law, to ensure that the civilian population is not deprived of essential goods and services. Second, Guyana calls on the Security Council to make impactful decisions to end the war. Pursuant to Article 24 of the Charter, member states of the United Nations conferred on this Security Council the mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security, and I quote, to ensure prompt and effective action by the United Nations, end of quote. We must therefore consider all options available to this Council to bring the war to a swift end. Let us starve the war of its fuel. Third, Mr. President, we must end the impunity with which these acts against the Palestinian people are being committed. One effect of the ongoing impunity has been that other actors have decided to use the ongoing hostilities in Gaza as a pretext to launch or intensify their own hostilities. The Council cannot afford to allow justice to be outsourced and must act decisively to ensure that it is served. I conclude by emphasizing the most urgent need to address all the dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the current manifestation of the conflict which began on 7th October. In the short term, we must secure a ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and the rapid delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale to the Palestinian people. Simultaneously, we must work to ensure that Palestinians exercise their right to self-determination, including through the creation of their own independent state based on the pre-1967 borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Special Coordinator Wensland and Director Wosornu for your briefings today. Colleagues, the United States' commitment to Israel's security is ironclad, and I want to repeat, ironclad. We want to see Hamas defeated, Sinwar and other Hamas leaders brought to justice, and the hostages released. We have been very clear that we oppose Hamas's control of Gaza. At the same time, we also do not support and will not support an Israeli reoccupation of Gaza. And we have long maintained our objection to any large-scale military operation in Rafah that risks mass civilian harm. The United States has been clear about these positions in private with our Israeli partners, just as we have articulated them publicly time and again. We heard today that the UN estimates roughly 810,000 civilians have been displaced from Rafah in recent days. Many of those people have been displaced multiple times since October 7. It is, therefore, evident, notwithstanding the clear and consistent warnings of the United States and the broader international community, that Israel's preparations to meet the needs for those displaced people are insufficient. Palestinians who are in Rafah or have fled from it now face life-threatening conditions, including the threat of mass contagion from raw sewage. Israel should take immediate and decisive actions to remedy this situation and ensure the protection of civilians. There must be no delay. Lives depend on it. We are also gravely concerned that the Rafah crossing remains closed and that Kerem Shalom is only sporadically accessible to humanitarians. These crossings are vital lifelines, and their closures reverse the gains in humanitarian access achieved in recent weeks. So let me be clear. The Rafah crossing must be reopened now. There can be no further delay. Again, lives depend on it. Of course, humanitarian aid cannot reach civilians if humanitarian workers are not protected. The United States is deeply troubled by the incident of May 13, in which a UN international staff member was killed and another seriously injured. Our thoughts remain with the victims' families and loved ones. We take note of the UN statement that the vehicle involved in this incident was targeted with a tank round during a movement the UN stated was appropriately reported through deconfliction procedures. We need not wait for the results of an investigation to know what more Israel can and must do to fix the broken deconfliction process in Gaza. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan emphasized to Israeli leaders yesterday the specific steps necessary to build a more effective deconfliction mechanism. These include 24/7 access to IDF decision makers with clear information sharing at all times, and the need to avoid unnecessary delays for assistance convoys through the establishment of fixed corridors inside Gaza. We reiterate our calls to establish mechanisms to facilitate visa issuances and the entry and exit of humanitarian and medical personnel. We also underscore the difficulties humanitarian workers face, which impair their ability to provide life-saving assistance to Gazans, including frequent closures of crossing gates and paralyzing delays at checkpoints. We condemn the recent attacks on humanitarian convoys traversing the West Bank. Israel is responsible for the security of these convoys. It must stop the attacks and hold the perpetrators accountable. The growing humanitarian crisis in Rafah comes as there are some signs of progress in the center and north. Late last week, the first shipments of humanitarian assistance arrived on the shores of Gaza through the multinational humanitarian pier. The tireless work of the United States and several critical partners created the conditions to enable this additive avenue for aid into Gaza. When at full operating capacity, the humanitarian maritime corridor can provide assistance for up to 500,000 people in 1 month. More aid from the United States and other countries continues to arrive in Cyprus, where it will be loaded onto ships for delivery to the pier. But in the effort to mitigate famine, aid by sea is not a substitute for aid provided by land. And so, the United States continues to work to further increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza by land crossings. In recent weeks and months, the United States has proposed alternatives to a major ground offensive in Rafah that we believe will better advance Israel's goal of an enduring defeat of Hamas and ensure the protection of civilians. We continue to urge Israel to connect its military operations to a political strategy that can ensure the lasting defeat of Hamas, the release of all the hostages, and a better future for Gaza. Colleagues, just as the United States has been clear with Israel's leadership about our views regarding the best course of action in Rafah, this Council must be clear with Hamas on the need to reach a deal to bring about a ceasefire with the release of hostages. We heard from Hamas's victims at the ARIA convened by the United States last week. They spoke with a moral clarity and demonstrated a basic decency that some members of this Council sadly lack in their refusal to condemn Hamas for its terrorism and atrocities. Over the weekend, Israel announced it had recovered the bodies of 4 hostages killed by Hamas. Our condolences go out to the families of these individuals. Their deaths are a further reminder of the suffering caused by Hamas since October 7. As President Biden emphasized yesterday, we need an immediate ceasefire to stop the fighting and bring the hostages home. Hamas must comply with the Security Council's resolutions and release the hostages. That is how to bring the fighting to an end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Mozambique. I wish to thank Mr. Ton Wensland, a special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, and Ms. Edem Wosornu, Director of Operation and Advocacy, OCHA, for their comprehensive briefings on the situation in Gaza. Distinguished Council members, Rafah has become the focus of international attention and great concern due to the potential for catastrophic civilian suffering from any large-scale Israel military offensive, as repeatedly warned by Israel authorities themselves. For the last 7 months, the Gaza Strip has tragically become one of the most dangerous places on the earth for civilians caught in the crossfire, facing death, horror, and displacement on a massive scale. Even humanitarian workers are not spared of the killings. We must recognize and act urgently to alleviate this immense and unacceptable suffering. Reports of forced civilian displacement in Rafah and the denial of vital humanitarian aid are alarming violations of international law that cannot be tolerated. We reiterate our call for immediate action to address this deepening humanitarian crisis. While acknowledging ongoing diplomatic efforts toward a ceasefire, we believe a major Israeli military operation in Rafah would be disastrous, with catastrophic and unimaginable consequences for civilians. We echo the repeated calls from leaders, UN officials, and NGOs for Israel to fully comply with its obligations under international law, including allowing increased humanitarian access and prioritizing civilian protection in Gaza. Colleagues, given the scales of potential catastrophe, humanitarian assistance must take precedence over any obstacles or pretexts. All efforts must be made to ensure that aid reaches those in desperate need swiftly and unimpeded. This Council has approved binding Resolution 2712, 2720, and 2728 to address the Gaza situation in line with the international law. We strongly encourage engagement with all parties to ensure full and urgent implementation of these resolutions. It is critical to cease hostilities immediately, strengthen diplomatic pressure for a just peace, and uphold the human rights and dignity of the long-suffering Palestinian people. Dear colleagues, while recognizing the complexities involved, we urge Israel to carefully weigh its stated military objective against the interconnected factors of civilian safety and stability in the entire region. We recognize that the situation in Rafah is very complex, with military objectives, civilian safety, and the international relations all at play. Israel's determination to topple Hamas' remaining battalions in Rafah must carefully consider these interconnected factors. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, Gaza will haunt the conscience of the world long after this genocide stops. And stop it must, and it must now. We have spoken too many times, and our people are still being murdered every single day. So let me just say the following today. 2 million people have lost loved ones in the last 7 months, lost family members, lost friends, lost limbs, lost their homes, lost their communities, schools, universities, hospitals were destroyed. People are being starved to death. Refugees from the 1948 Nakba, who were waiting for the day the Nakba ends, are forced to live it with even more cruelty and devastation than 76 years ago. This is happening despite the decisions of every relevant international body on earth and calls by nearly every state in the world. There is only one conclusion to draw from these facts. Israel is deliberately destroying life in Gaza, and it will not be deterred by the rules of international law or positions adopted by states or international bodies. It will only be deterred by resolute action, holding it accountable for its decisions and forcing it to change course. Mr. President, The whole world opposed Israelis' assault on Rafah, and yet Israel is proceeding. All of you opposed going into Rafah, yet the Israeli government is proceeding. Israel has pushed an entire population to the southern border of Gaza, to Rafah, through mass killing and destruction. People were forcibly displaced time and time again in horrific conditions. They are being displaced yet again by the hundreds of thousands with nowhere to go, nowhere to stay, nowhere to be safe, dragging what remains of their lives, confronted with death all around them, abandoned to this terrifying fate. In parallel, Israel has escalated its massacres in northern Gaza, notably in Jabalia. Israel, instead of opening crossing points for humanitarian aid, decided to seize by force the Rafah crossing while providing cover for the destruction of humanitarian aid by Israeli settlers and extremists in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. At a time where the international community was calling to flood Gaza with humanitarian aid to stop the famine underway and the human suffering resulting from this horrible siege, Israel imposed on our people a drought of humanitarian aid, a deliberate and undeniable use of starvation as a method of war. Israel must pull out from the Rafah crossing, open all crossings, and allow the unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid, and must withdraw its occupation forces from the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, Israel has determined who its enemies are: the Palestinian people as a whole, the United Nations, its agencies, the Secretary General, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, the world courts, the NGOs, Palestinian, Israeli, and international, and every state on earth that dares to denounce its crimes. Mr. President, with what audacity does Israel kill, maim, forcibly displace, arbitrarily arrest, torture, starve an entire civilian population? With what audacity does it occupy and annex our land? With what audacity does it give itself a right of life and death over every single Palestinian, and proclaims it has a right to veto our national rights, including to self-determination and to the independence of our state? With the audacity, or should I say arrogance, that impunity provides. We speak often in this chamber of the international law-based order. Israel is asking you to destroy the international-based order with your own hands so it can continue killing our people and annexing our land in full impunity. It will not listen to reason or to your protests, to your calls or your demands. You have tried every other way possible, and Israel has gone further and further in its breach of the UN Charter and the law. It expects everything from you: blind political support, weapons, full economic and trade privileges, and rejects any commitment in return to abide by the rule of international law, to end its occupation, and to advance just and lasting peace. Israel insults and humiliates its closest friends and allies. It expects them to align their policies with its crimes, to sacrifice everything they stand for, to stand not by Israel but by Israelis' colonial, supremacist, and inhumane policies towards the Palestinian people. This is becoming increasingly impossible for many of them. And we believe that very soon we will reach a tipping point where countries will stand up to defend freedom, justice, and peace, and there are important signs already to that effect. Indeed, peoples around the world are making themselves heard. Governments are more and more outspoken. But please remember that every day without reaching that tipping point means lives destroyed. I urge you to use every tool at your disposal to stop the massacres as Security Council and as states. Let me repeat. I urge you to use every tool at your disposal, and you have many of them, to stop the massacres as Security Council and as states. A whole nation is fighting for its survival before your very eyes. The future of our region, the future of our world, the future of this international law-based order will depend on what you do next. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, this morning, in an act of outrageous absurdity and moral bankruptcy, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced that he will seek arrest warrants for Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders. This is despicable and unforgettable day on which an immoral equivalence is being made between a terror organization and the leaders of a vibrant democracy. This is a dark day for the international community and a dark day for international institutions. Israel suffered the most brutal massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Men, women, and children were targeted and murdered. Babies were burned alive. Rape and sexual violence were widespread. And from October 7th until today, Israel has been fighting against this evil to bring our hostages home and to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Israel is fighting for her future, justly, morally, and in accordance with international law. Yet, to the ICC prosecutor, the genocidal terrorists hold the same moral standing as the leaders of the law-abiding state of Israel. It is unfathomable. It is an immoral distortion of epic proportions. This is a blood libel, a witch hunt driven by pure Jew hatred and political interests. But even more than that, this is a clear sign of what international organizations have become. These international institutions, be it the ICC, the Human Rights Council, UNRWA, and other bodies, were established with the best of intentions. But now these organizations have lost their way. The International Criminal Court is now a weapon of criminals and terrorists. Their moral compass has broken. Today, the forces of evil have physical weapons. They have missiles, rockets, drones, and guns, as you've seen. But beyond these tools of war, they also have diplomatic and legal weapons, an arsenal of evil which includes the weaponization of this institution and its bodies. All have become tools in the hands of monsters, and you continue playing along, playing directly into their hands. Wake up. Look at the world burning around you. Just this morning, you held a moment of silence to commemorate the mass murdering president of Iran. A month ago, Raisi, as the Iranian people call him, the butcher of Tehran, launched an unprecedented missile and drone strike on Israel to murder thousands of innocent Israelis, deliberately. The blood of thousands of innocent Iranians is on his hands. Women, members of the LGBTQ community, peaceful protesters, and many, many others. He is responsible for butchering thousands around the globe. Thousands. This is who the Security Council dedicates a moment of silence to? A terrorist? A man who murdered, oppressed, and imprisoned so many? How can it be that your list of moral priorities is so distorted? This council, which has done nothing to advance the release of our hostages, commemorates the man responsible for their suffering. What's next? Will the council hold a moment of silence for bin Laden? Will there be a vigil for Hitler? We wouldn't be surprised. Council members, this is a dark day for the ICC. This is a dark day for the Security Council. And this is a dark day for all the international bodies that have become weapons in the hands of murderers. Merely 4 days ago, 4 days have passed since this council heard the chilling testimonies of released Israeli hostages, of the heart-wrenching story of a mother whose son's body is being held in Gaza by terrorists. You waited over 7 months to hear a single word from released Israeli hostages. But it took only 4 days to forget their gut-churning stories and hold a discussion on how to prevent their release, because that's what you're doing here today. Here we are in a formal, this time formal, council meeting, continuing to do nothing productive to advance their release, the hostages' release. Instead of working to bring them home, you are convening to find ways to keep the hostages in Rafah. This council doesn't function through logic or morality. Sadly, it is simply a political tool exploited by some members to advance skewed agendas, because they can ask for additional council meetings time and again. What started this war was not the humanitarian situation in Gaza. It wasn't an impending operation in Rafah. What started this war was the sheer evil perpetrated by Hamas. And the way to end this war is not by discussing Israel's operation in Rafah. It is by finally holding the murderous terrorists accountable. Israel entered Gaza to bring our hostages home and to ensure that Hamas cannot pose a threat to Israelis. It is that simple. We didn't want to be in Gaza. We don't want to be in Gaza. We have no intentions to stay in Gaza. This is only about saving lives and defending our future from a terror organization. And what is the focus here today? To again give the terrorists immunity. So, colleagues, do you honestly think that Israel wants to operate in Rafah? Let me clarify. No country seeks to avoid an operation in Rafah more than Israel. No country, because it is our best and brightest that are making the ultimate sacrifice there, not yours. But there are still thousands of Hamas terrorists in Rafah, and you ignore them. Hostages are being held there, and you ignore them. And Hamas leaders are hiding in Rafah, and you ignore them. We have already uncovered 50 terror tunnels in Rafah, 50. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. What do you expect Israel to do? What would your countries do about everything that I just mentioned? Is there an alternative? Should we pray to God that Hamas just disappears? Is there a magic spell that we should cast to make sure that October 7th is never repeated? Every day we learn of more hostages murdered by Hamas. The clock is ticking, and we must take every step to bring them home. This is why a counter-terror operation in Rafah must take place. There is no other choice. You cannot extinguish a fire by putting only most of it out. It will spread again, and you know it. The fire of terror is burning in Rafah. Sadly, there is no alternative. But if this council wanted to take steps that could truly advance an end to this war, then I have a proposition for you. Designate Hamas as a terror organization. Impose sanctions on their leaders. Demand that they release the hostages and put down their arms. Show them that the council no longer follow their script. This war can end today, tomorrow. It's up to you. If Hamas returns the hostages and surrenders, not one more shot needs to be fired. Why are you not echoing this message to the world? It is Hamas that murdered and brutalized Israelis. It is Hamas that is holding 128 hostages. And it is Hamas that has sworn to commit the atrocities of October 7th again and again until Israel is destroyed. Call out the terrorists. Tell the Gazans who it is that is truly responsible for their suffering. Colleagues, when it comes to the evacuation of civilians from Rafah, my heart truly goes out to them. It is terrible. It is truly terrible that they have to be evacuated, many of them not for the first time. I agree with you. But the removal of civilians from an active war zone is not an act that should be condemned here. It is an act that should be supported, especially by a council mandated to uphold security and protect life. Close to 1 million civilians have already left Rafah, and more are leaving every day. They have moved to a designated humanitarian zone that is being filled with aid. And our hope is for as many more civilians to leave Rafah and move out of harm's way. Because you know why? Because temporary evacuation is reversible, but the loss of life is not. Israel is advancing its operation in Gaza slowly and carefully. Despite the fact that any military expert would tell you here that wars are won by taking swift and overwhelming action, but we try to mitigate as many civilian casualties as possible. What do you expect us to do? Should we grant immunity to the terrorists still in Rafah? Have you considered the message this will send to terrorists worldwide? What is the message here? Hide behind your civilians and receive immunity from the Security Council. Mr. President, today the Council chose to continue sitting idle. What the Council should be doing is taking action. Action against Hamas terrorists, action against Iran, and action against all those who seek to deliberately murder, rape, and destroy. Utilize your power and pressure the terrorists. Help bring this war to an end with Hamas eliminated and our hostages returned. Help us bring a brighter future for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt. You have the floor, sir.
شكرا سيد الرئيس نشكركم على عقد هذا الاجتماع بطلب من الجزائر وسلوفينيا ونشكر المنسق الخاص تور فينسلاند والسيدة ووسنو من الأوتشا على إحاطتيهما الكشفتين. سيد الرئيس، يشهد قطاع غزة منذ أكتوبر الماضي كارثة إنسانية مروعة، كارثة من صنع الإنسان جراء الحرب غير القانونية التي تشنها إسرائيل على القطاع، والتي أودت بحياة أكثر من 34,000 شهيد أغلبهم من النساء والأطفال، و78,000 جريح وتدمير 60% من المباني السكنية وخروج 24 مستشفى من أصل 32 مستشفى من الخدمة كلية وانهيار البنية التحتية تقريبا بشكل كامل وهو ما يعكس منهج إسرائيل لتحويل القطاع عمدا إلى منطقة غير قابلة للحياة. سيد الرئيس، رغم كافة المناشدات الدولية لإسرائيل بوقف نزيف الدماء وإيقاف القتل المستمر بحق المدنيين ورغم مساعي الوساطة المستمرة لمصر بالاشتراك مع قطر والولايات المتحدة رغم قرارات مجلس الأمن العديدة كان الرد على الجميع عملية عسكرية أخرى في رفح ومحيطها التي تضم أكثر من مليون مدني أجبروا على النزوح قسريا عدة مرات بلا متاع ولا دواء ولا غذاء كافٍ وعلى مدار أشهر بما أفضى لكارثة إنسانية غير نضع أمامكم مشهد تلك الجريمة الإنسانية التي تحدث في رفح حاليا ونحمل المجتمع الدولي بأسره تبعاته ونستشهد أمامكم استجلاء المشهد الإنساني الدامي بتصريحات المفوض العام للأونروا التي أشار فيها إلى عدم مصداقية الادعاءات الإسرائيلية بإمكانية انتقال المدنيين إلى مناطق آمنة التي أكد فيها أيضا على تدهور الأوضاع الإنسانية ونزوح أكثر من 800,000 مواطن فلسطيني من رفح بما يقارب من نصف عدد الفلسطينيين الذين أجبروا مسبقا أو في السابق على النزوح إليها كما أكد لازاريني افتقاد المناطق التي يتم توجيه الناس إليها للحد الأدنى من الظروف الملائمة لتقديم المساعدة الإنسانية إليها موضحا انتهاء مخزون المساعدات واستحالة توزيع المتبقى منها بسبب غلق المعابر وعدم توفير الأمن. سيد الرئيس، في ذلك السياق تود مصر أن تضع أمام أعضاء مجلس الأمن والعالم بأسره بعض الحقائق التي يجب أن تكون من المسلمات لدى الجميع. أولاً، أن إسرائيل باعتبارها القوة القائمة بالاحتلال ملزمة بكافة قرارات مجلس الأمن ومحكمة العدل الدولية الصادرة منذ بداية الأزمة وكذلك أحكام القانون الدولي والقانون الدولي الإنساني وقوانين ونشدد على أن تطبيق تلك القرارات والأحكام لا يجب أن يكون على سبيل الاختيار
is not optional, is not a matter of choice. These provisions cannot be selectively applied. They are mandatory. They're bounding. International law is not a mantle donned by countries whenever they wish to, depending on their whims. Second,
لا يجب علينا استساغة المبررات الواهية للعملية العسكرية في رفح أو الادعاءات الجوفاء التي تكررها سلطة الاحتلال عن الإجراءات التي اتخذتها
regarding measures that have been taken to alleviate the impact of the humanitarian repercussions. It has been proven that these claims are not credible if famine is imminent in Gaza, as indicated in UN reports. Third, the flow of humanitarian aid through the Rafah border crossing has stopped, which is a direct result of the continued and condemned military Israeli operation in Palestinian Rafah, an operation that was rejected and warned against by the whole international community. It is a manifestation of Israeli persistence in imposing a collective punishment upon Palestinians. Israel aims to tighten the siege on
civilians by militarily controlling the border and creating conditions on the ground that make any humanitarian action almost impossible. Mr. President, deliberate Israeli practices have led to clashes and a security situation that has become a direct threat to the lives of humanitarian workers. Some of them already lost their lives. Humanitarian action by agencies operating from the Palestinian side and ensuring the flow of aid is now tantamount to a suicidal mission. In this context, I would like to recall that in the Israeli war on Gaza, it is the fire of the Israeli army that killed and injured a large number of humanitarian workers, more than 190 of UN workers and other NGO staff. This current situation is not a coincidence. Israel is fully aware of the impact of its operation on the ground, and you all are fully aware that Israel has been aiming since the beginning of the war to turn the Gaza Strip into an uninhabitable place through deliberate practices that are so clearly and so blatantly violations of international law and international humanitarian law. Fourth, it is possible to resume humanitarian action if Israel shoulders its responsibilities, if it withdrew immediately from the Rafah border crossing, if it opened all 6 border crossings to Gaza from the Israeli side, and if it ensured the flow of humanitarian aid. In this context, we are surprised and we reject that some disregard the fact that these border crossings exist. We reject that they're going along with a narrative that implies that aid can only be delivered through the Rafah crossing. This narrative aims to distort facts, aims to holding Egypt and the United Nations responsible for the aid not being delivered, despite the efforts made to ensure the flow of aid to our Palestinian brethren and the burdens we're carrying as a result of the obstacles that occupation authorities have been putting in our way for the past 7 months. Fifth, Egypt seeks to ensure the end of the war and the provision of humanitarian aid and the release of hostages and prisoners from both sides. This is based on our firm commitment to international law and international humanitarian law. This is the same commitment that prompted us to join the case filed by South Africa at the ICJ. We joined the case because we believe in the role of the ICJ in achieving justice, and because Egypt has played a pioneering role in achieving peace in the region, and we are fully committed to the rights of the Palestinians. This commitment is based on principles, and we do not accept it to be bargained with. In conclusion, Mr. President, we completely reject the military operation in Rafah, and we warn of the disastrous humanitarian repercussions. We call upon the Security Council and the international community to compel Israel to shoulder its responsibilities stipulated in international humanitarian law in a clear and unequivocal way. You must exercise pressure to stop all military operations in the Gaza Strip. You must create a safe environment to resume humanitarian action in line with Security Council resolutions, especially Resolution 2720 and the decisions of the ICJ and the provisions of international humanitarian law. Egypt will continue to work tirelessly to find ways to ensure the urgent and safe provision of humanitarian aid in line with our humanitarian duty towards our Palestinian brethren. We will continue to support Palestinians as they resist on their territories any attempts of forced displacement and the use of the siege and starvation to
push people away from the Gaza Strip. Council members, stop the daily flagrant violations of international humanitarian law, stop the crimes perpetrated against the Palestinian people, stop the war. I thank you, Mr. President, and sorry for taking too long.
I thank the representative of Egypt for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
The 9,630th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is non-proliferation. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Belarus, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Nicaragua, and the Syrian Arab Republic to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/383, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Belarus, China, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Nicaragua, the Russian Federation, and the Syrian Arab Republic. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. And I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we all remember on the 24th of April, in this chamber, the United States, Japan, and the allies were unable to explain ultimately what the added value was behind their draft resolution on the placement of weapons of mass destruction in outer space, reaffirming the obligations which arise ultimately for all signatories to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. They were unable to argument in a reasonable way their refusal to introduce in the draft a proposal we had on preventing an arms race in outer space, which made the document, which added some sense of purpose to this document. The vote showed that the Western Initiative had a single motivation to attempt to portray the Russian Federation in unfavorable light and to in an unsubstantiated way to assign to us a certain plan of action which we do not have. This is a situation that dealt a major blow to international efforts geared towards keeping outer space peaceful. However, insofar as preventing an arms race in outer space and keeping space peacefully for peaceful purposes is it a paramount priority for us, we decided to provide our Western colleagues with another opportunity, not in word, but in deed, to demonstrate the peaceful nature of their intentions. For that purpose, we drafted an alternative draft Security Council resolution. This, unlike the blatantly politicized American-Japanese resolution, will help to guarantee the exclusively peaceful exploration and use of outer space. We are confident that the peaceful use of outer space, which became a symbol of grandiose achievements in science and technology, is intended to serve as an effective means for resolving many global problems, including issues related to economic development. To this, the international community has been striving for more than half a century now. We also are persuaded of the need to prevent the transformation of outer space into yet another arena for confrontation and warfare. Now, more than ever before, it is necessary for space to completely be precluded from the arms race, for it to be preserved for peaceful purposes, and for these to become universally recognized international premises. The draft resolution we submitted is comprehensive in nature. It contains well-known provisions which reflect the interests and aspirations of the overwhelming majority of the members of the United Nations. Thanks to its broad scope, it is geared towards reaffirmation of state obligations not to use outer space for the placement of any forms of weapons, including weapons of mass destruction. Incidentally, this is specifically the language which the U.S. colleagues, with trumped-up pretext, demonstrably refused to incorporate into their draft resolution at the Security Council from the very beginning. Having conducted work on the document, we responsibly approached taking into account the concerns of all members. And I would further note that we made accommodations to Western colleagues, even lifting a principled important reference in the text of the Russian-Chinese draft treaty on the non-placement of weapons in outer space. Incidentally, this document remains on the negotiating table as part of the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. At the same time, the above-mentioned draft treaty retains relevant and necessary, and it is regarded as the basis for future negotiations on the multilateral, legally binding instrument to prevent an arms race in outer space. Distinguished colleagues, the draft resolution is exceptionally significant in the context of those challenges which we are encountering in outer space. The adoption of this draft resolution will help to reaffirm our collective duty to keep peaceful space, to keep outer space peaceful, and to make a meaningful contribution to the reinforcement of international peace and security. Today's vote is a unique moment of truth for our Western colleagues. If they fail to support this, then they will clearly show that their main priority remains keeping a freedom of leeway for themselves to expedite the militarization of outer space. This would be particularly blatant in light of the fact that all of the provisions introduced by the U.S. and Japan on non-placement of WMDs in outer space, including nuclear weapons, have been preserved in our draft without any changes whatsoever. We urge all conscientious participants in outer space activity to support this initiative. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, we are here today because Russia seeks to distract global attention from its development of a new satellite carrying a nuclear device. On April 24, Russia vetoed a resolution supported by 13 members of the Security Council that called on all member states not to develop nuclear weapons specifically designed to be placed in orbit. That resolution, which was a product of nearly 2 months of constructive negotiations and co-sponsored by 65 countries, reflected a simple reality. Placement of a nuclear weapon into orbit would not only violate the Outer Space Treaty, it would also threaten human spaceflight, as well as the vital communications, scientific, meteorological, agricultural, commercial, and national security services that any and all satellites provide to people around the globe. We have heard President Putin say publicly that Russia has no intention of deploying nuclear weapons in space. If that were the case, Russia would not have vetoed that resolution. Over the past several weeks, and following widespread condemnation from a geographically diverse group of member states in the General Assembly on May 6, Russia has sought to distract from its dangerous efforts to put a nuclear weapon into orbit. The culmination of Russia's campaign of diplomatic gaslighting and dissembling is the text before us today. Drafted through a hasty process that did not take into account legitimate, repeated, and shared concerns by a majority of this Council, Russia's resolution does not achieve the simple task that we set out to achieve several months ago: reaffirm the basic obligations of the Outer Space Treaty and avoid a nuclear arms race in space. Consequently, the United States will not support this disingenuous resolution. We urge the Council to reject it and instead reiterate our call for Russia to join every other member of this Council in supporting the common sense, straightforward text that dozens of member states supported only 4 weeks ago. Again, Russia does not want the Security Council to focus on its dangerous actions in space. Its veto then requires that we be skeptical of its statements today and its intentions in putting forward this resolution. It's also vital we not lose track of some simple facts. First, rather than enhance arms control, the Russian text put forward today would narrow the scope of efforts in other United Nations bodies in a way that would be detrimental to preventing an arms race in outer space. Second, by seeking to use this resolution to put forward language on other topics that Russia knows does not have consensus support in this Council, Russia's text also distracts from affirming the important obligations of all 116 states parties to the Outer Space Treaty, including that no nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction be put into orbit. Third, the text that Russia vetoed on April 24 went to great lengths to address every Council member's concerns in a broader and more inclusive manner than what Russia has forced on the Council today. To repeat, the resolution that Russia vetoed was supported by 13 members of this Council and was co-sponsored by 65 member states. It reflected the strong global consensus, as the President of the General Assembly, Ambassador Francis, later declared during the Assembly's May 6 meeting that, and I quote, "Outer space does not belong to individual nations. Its peaceful and sustainable use is not subject to national appropriation and must be a place of peace and cooperation for the benefit and in the interest of all countries," unquote. The United States could not agree more. For our part, the United States will continue to demonstrate how space activities can be conducted in a responsible, peaceful, and sustainable manner in order to preserve the benefits of space for current and future generations. We also will continue to put a bright spotlight on Russia's troubling actions in space and how they diverge from its statements here in the Security Council. Indeed, just last week, on May 16, Russia launched a satellite into low Earth orbit that the United States assesses is likely a counter-space weapon presumably capable of attacking other satellites in low Earth orbit. Russia deployed this new counter-space weapon into the same orbit as a U.S. government satellite. Russia's May 16 launch follows prior Russian satellite launches, likely of counter-space systems, to low Earth orbit in 2019 and 2022. Colleagues, I urge you to vote no on this distraction and to join us in pressing Russia to cease its obstruction here in the Security Council. And we urge you to join us in making clear to Russia that the world will not turn a blind eye to its dangerous and unprecedented efforts to develop a new satellite carrying a nuclear device, which undermines its obligations under the Outer Space Treaty and counters the views of an overwhelming majority of members of the Security Council. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their important statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Господин председатель, Mr. President,
слушая страстную речь американского
представителя,
мы недоумевали,
zealous statement of the U.S. representative,
о какой резолюции
we had a
он ведет
difficulty understanding which resolution he was talking about. Did he read the resolution that has been placed on the table? The United States, not for the first time, has been accusing the Russian Federation of striving to place nuclear weapons in outer space. Just now, the U.S. representative referred to some kind of a satellite, which, in his opinion, once again, in a highly likely style, can be likely possibly placed on a nuclear engine. I didn't even fully understand what he was talking about, but that's not what is important. If the United States is accusing the Russian Federation of striving to place nuclear weapons in outer space, then what does the U.S. representative not like in the text of the resolution which proposed? The text contains identical wording, the same as the U.S. draft resolution, which was vetoed by us on the 24th April, and for good reason, because that draft resolution which you submitted, the U.S. delegation submitted, limited the scope of the resolution merely to weapons of mass destruction. We are now proposing a resolution which encompasses both WMDs and all forms of other weapons in outer space. We're talking about preventing an arms race in outer space. Let the U.S. representative, if he can, try to explain to us where he sees the defects in our resolution insofar as it almost virtually is identical to the text of the resolution proposed by the U.S. and supplements it with all other forms of weapons which we believe must not be placed in outer space. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize for taking the floor, but I obviously need to respond to the remarks made by the Russian representative. In answer to his question, yes, I read your bad text. Your text includes a lengthy binding mechanism that cannot be verified. That is clear. We have had those discussions in Geneva before with regard to the type of treaty that you would like to see come into place. So we've seen this movie before. What I would submit to my Russian colleague is that we let the Council decide on his text, and we're about to do that. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/383 please raise their hand? Those against? Those abstaining? The result of the voting is as follows: 7 votes in favor, 7 votes against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. The first on the list is the representative of Algeria. You have.
Mr. President, Algeria voted in favor of the draft resolution as it aligns with our long-standing position on the peaceful use of outer space and the prevention from its weaponization. As outlined in our constant position, Algeria firmly believes that outer space is the common heritage of humankind. It must be explored and utilized for the benefit of all nations, irrespective of their level of economic or scientific development. The draft resolution rightly calls upon all states, particularly those with major space capabilities, to actively contribute to the objective of peaceful use and prevent an arms race in outer space. We reiterate the importance of all states to refrain from actions that contradict this objective and existing treaties in the interest of maintaining international peace and security. The text commendably made reference to key documents such as the Outer Space Treaty, the NPT, and the Space 2030 Agenda, underlining the importance of international law and the crucial role of the Conference on Disarmament in negotiating multilateral agreements. Its emphasis on strict compliance with the Outer Space Treaty and other relevant legal instruments is crucial. Upholding and promoting universal adherence to these treaties is essential for preserving outer space for peaceful purposes. The draft resolution rightly underscores the urgent need for further measures, including legal binding instruments, to prevent an arms race in outer space. We have consistently championed the importance of negotiating such instruments. To conclude, Algeria reiterates its unwavering commitment to the prevention of an arms race in outer space and the preservation of outer space for peaceful purposes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea voted against the resolution for two reasons. First, the Russian draft contained the language which did not reach consensus among Security Council members. Among this was one operative paragraph, OP8, which was identical to the Russian amendment not adopted at the previous meeting on April 24th. Given the dual-use nature of many space systems, it is very difficult to define a weapon in space, and so is the verification on compliance, even if we have a legally binding agreement. Ambiguity may lead to legal divergence and open the door to the intentional evasion of legal obligations. That is why many states, including the Republic of Korea, believe that we need to further develop rules, norms, and principles in order to address and tackle the present and the potential threats in the space domain in a relevant manner. The Russian text did not properly reflect these views. Second, the draft was put to vote without sufficient consultations. Despite several Council members' requests to have the resolution be balanced, the Russian Federation barely changed the text and put it in blue text as soon as the non-objection procedure was broken. Apparently, Russia was not intent on conducting the negotiations in good faith. This is all the more regrettable because Russia vetoed a draft resolution on the same topic, which enjoyed 13 votes of support, including E10 within the Council. Taking this opportunity, the Republic of Korea would like to emphasize that the Security Council needs to be more proactive in addressing emerging security challenges, especially in the space and the cyber domains. Throughout its term in the Security Council, the Republic of Korea stands ready to work with other Council members to make the Security Council more agile and relevant in maintaining international peace and security in our rapidly changing world. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Malta voted against this resolution, which failed to include the views of many Council members. We have done so on substance and, even more so, on procedural grounds. With regards to the text, while largely based on the resolution presented by Japan and the US, this draft removed key elements, including the reference to the applicability of international law in outer space. Such reference was supported by many Council members, and we regret its deletion. Furthermore, this draft contained two additional non-consensual OPs, which sought to divide the Council rather than achieving consensus. In fact, the same language contained in one of the two OPs was recently voted down in this very room when it was presented as an amendment to the resolution by Japan and the United States. On the other hand, we are disappointed by the approach adopted by the penholder. It is regrettable to see that a permanent member first vetoed a resolution on this topic, stressing that the Council should not discuss outer space and should not reaffirm existing obligations, only to then present its own draft on the same topic. Moreover, after only one round of consultations, it placed under silence a text that failed to address almost all of the concerns expressed by other members. This is not striving for consensus. This is not how we advance the interests of the wider UN membership. Initiatives like this only contribute to discrediting this body. As we have said before, we had a timely opportunity to adopt the first Security Council resolution on outer space and reaffirm the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. We missed this when the resolution was vetoed last month. Our collective goal is to ensure that outer space remains a peaceful domain for the benefit of all humankind. As space capabilities continue to increase, we believe that this Council should play a role in addressing these threats to international peace and security. To conclude, we once again reaffirm our principled position against all nuclear weapons and WMDs in outer space, on Earth, and anywhere. We stand ready to engage constructively on outer space discussions in all relevant fora, including the Security Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by reminding you all of what our Russian colleague stated in this chamber just a few weeks ago. He stated in this chamber, quote, "The discussion of space security issues and the decisions taken should be comprehensive and should involve all the UN members. Otherwise, this is nothing but an obvious attempt to impose the opinion of UN Security Council members on the rest of the UN membership." End of quote. The same delegation now proposed a draft resolution on outer space security to this Council, which the rest of the UN membership would not accept. We cannot find consistency in their approach. Throughout the negotiation on this draft text, our delegation made its best efforts to find compromise by offering concrete proposals to converge the divergent views among the Council members. We regret that the penholder did not fully take into account such constructive suggestions and decided to put forward a text with a number of divisive elements. For example, on the prevention of arms race in outer space, while there is consensus to take further measures and appropriate international negotiations in accordance with the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty at this stage, there is no consensus among UN member states on a specific way forward. That is why the General Assembly and the Conference on Disarmament continue to discuss this important issue. Maintaining the peaceful nature of outer space is greatly relevant to the work of the Security Council. However, we believe the Council should complement the efforts made in other relevant fora rather than preempting or prejudging the result of such efforts. Japan reiterates its strong commitment to ensuring the security, stability, and sustainability of outer space and the objective of preventing an arms race in outer space. However, significant challenges remain in defining and verifying a weapon in outer space. This derives from the dual-use nature of space objects and technologies, as well as the need to address space threats in a comprehensive manner. In order to address security challenges in outer space, it is crucial to focus on how certain objects or capabilities are applied and used. Based on this position, we voted against on today's voting. Before concluding, there's another note I would like to emphasize. This draft resolution in OP7 calls upon UN member states not to develop nuclear weapons or any other kinds of WMD specifically designed to be placed in outer space. We are pleased to see that the proponents of this resolution are now ready to proactively commit to this important principle, which Japan and the United States wanted to deliver in our draft resolution presented last month. Outer space must never be an arena for a nuclear arms race. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, garantir l'utilisation pacifique, sûre et durable de l'espace extra-atmosphérique contribue à notre sécurité et à notre prospérité. C'est un intérêt commun de tous les États. Il incombe non seulement aux organes dédiés, mais aussi à ce Conseil de préserver l'espace pour les générations futures. La Suisse insiste sur le fait que les différentes approches de la sécurité spatiale sont complémentaires. Nous restons attachés à notre position selon laquelle il faut impérativement prévenir une course aux armements, ainsi qu'un conflit armé dans l'espace extra-atmosphérique. Et à cette fin, le placement de tous les types d'armes, y compris les armes conventionnelles, devrait être interdit. Pour atteindre ces objectifs, nous pensons qu'il est nécessaire de développer des normes relatives au comportement responsable, ainsi que des instruments juridiquement contraignants. Après la négociation de la résolution présentée par le Japon et les États-Unis, qui a malheureusement échoué face au veto, et en examinant le projet actuel de la Russie, nous pensons qu'il y aurait suffisamment de points communs pour parvenir à un consensus. Bien que nous soutenons plusieurs éléments du projet présenté, nous regrettons que l'esprit de flexibilité est un cadre de confiance et fait défaut, et que nos suggestions visant à produire un texte qui nous unisse au lieu de nous diviser n'aient pas été prises en compte. Nous avons donc décidé de nous abstenir sur ce projet. Ce Conseil devrait pourtant agir dans un esprit de coopération et faire des enjeux tels que la sûreté dans l'espace un terrain d'entente commun, plutôt qu'une arène de confrontation où chacun tente de marquer le point. Nous regrettons que cela n'ait pas été le cas cette fois-ci, et espérons que les prochaines occasions seront saisies pour rapprocher les positions et parvenir à des terrains d'entente. La Suisse souligne que la mise en œuvre des dispositions du traité de l'ONU sur l'espace est obligatoire pour tous les États parties, et nous appelons une nouvelle fois tous les États qui ne l'ont pas encore fait à y adhérer sans délai. La Suisse reste convaincue qu'il est nécessaire et possible de s'accorder sur un produit au sein de ce Conseil sur un sujet aussi important pour la sécurité internationale et la prospérité de chacun de nos pays. Nous appelons tous les membres à s'unir et à rechercher des solutions en mettant l'accent sur les points communs plutôt que sur les divergences, afin d'obtenir des résultats qui fassent progresser le désarmement plutôt que d'aggraver les divisions. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. The United Kingdom is committed to preventing an arms race in outer space. That is why we introduced a resolution in the General Assembly last year establishing norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviour to reduce threats to space systems. It was adopted with the overwhelming support of 166 member states. And it is why the UK supported the US and Japan draft resolution in this Council, which sought to affirm the basic obligations of the Outer Space Treaty and prevent any nuclear weapons being placed in orbit around Earth. The detonation of a nuclear weapon in space could destroy or permanently damage a significant proportion of satellites in orbit around Earth, with highly disruptive and potentially life-threatening consequences for the essential space technology applications that we all rely on. It should be deeply concerning to all of us that Russia vetoed that resolution. Russia's counter-resolution that we voted on today was simply not credible. It was a cynical attempt to distract attention away from reports that Moscow is developing a new satellite carrying a nuclear device. The resolution was built around language that was voted down just a few weeks ago by this Council and was widely opposed again in negotiations. So why put it to a vote today? This was not a serious attempt to address the security of space. And Russia knows very well its proposals were not verifiable or enforceable. Coming from a country which has flouted so many obligations in arms control, this raises the red flag. Let me remind you of Russia's recent track record. Plans to withdraw ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, withdrawal from Open Skies and the Comprehensive Forces in Europe treaties, suspending participation in New START, violating the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention, and, of course, breaching this Council's resolutions on Iran and DPRK. Colleagues, we need to redouble efforts to avoid an arms race in outer space and to ensure our collective security. That requires serious, good faith discussion about the arms control architecture. We remain ready and willing to engage in those as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, Guyana voted in favor of the draft resolution titled The Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space and Outer Space Security, presented by the Russian Federation. We supported the draft resolution as it is consistent with our positions on General Assembly Resolution 78/238 and Draft Security Council Resolution S/2024/302, which was presented by Japan and the United States less than a month ago on the prevention of nuclear weapons in outer space, but unfortunately was not adopted due to Russia's veto. As a nation committed to the equitable and peaceful use of outer space, we recognize the importance of this draft resolution call for space to be free from all weapons. The prospect of weaponizing this domain poses a grave threat not only to global security, but also to the future of humanity's shared heritage in space. In this regard, we believe the draft text, which was not adopted, could have contributed to averting this grave threat. Guyana underscores that outer space must remain free of all weapons, including weapons of mass destruction. It is crucial that we safeguard this shared global common from the scourge of arms races, which can only exacerbate the threats to our collective security and hinder our development agendas. Mr. President, Guyana reiterates the importance of nuclear weapon states upholding their international obligations and committing to not place nuclear weapons in outer space. We also reiterate our commitment to supporting efforts that guarantee the right of all countries to benefit equitably from the peaceful use of outer space. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President.
El Ecuador está firmemente
Ecuador is
comprometido con la
firmly
promoción de la
committed
paz
to
y la
promoting
seguridad
international
internacionales
peace and
y
security,
cree que la regulación de
and
las
believes
actividades en
that
el espacio
regulating
extraterrestre
activities in outer
es uno de los
space is one
elementos
of the
esenciales de la
essential
arquitectura
elements of the
necesaria
necessary
para
architecture
garantizar
in
su
order to
sostenibilidad a
guarantee
largo plazo.
its long-term sustainability.
Por ello,
For this
fiel a sus
reason,
principios y
faithful
coherente
to
con
our
su posición,
principles and in
mi país votó a
coherence with
favor
our
de la
own
propuesta
position,
de
my country
resolución.
voted in favor of the
El
draft
Ecuador
resolution.
reconoce la
Ecuador
importancia de
recognizes the
preservar el
importance
espacio
of
ultraterrestre
preserving
como
outer
un entorno
space
pacífico
as a peaceful
y se opone a su anarquización
place and
y más aún a
opposes
su
anarchy in
militarización,
space and
lo
still
cual
more the
incluye el
militarization of
emplazamiento de
space, which
cualquier
would
tipo
include
de
the placement
armamento,
of any kind of
especialmente
weapon,
de armas de
particularly
destrucción en
weapons
masa.
of mass destruction.
No se puede soslayar
There is no
que la base
avoiding
del
the
texto
fact that
sometido
the
a
basis of the
consideración de
text
este
put
Consejo
to
se
this
basa en
Council's
el proyecto
consideration
vetado el
was
pasado
based on
24 de
the
abril,
draft which was vetoed on the
incluyendo el
24th
lenguaje
of
de la
April,
enmienda que no
including
contó con el
language
número
from
de
the
votos
amendment which did
necesarios
not receive
para
the
su
number of
adopción,
favourable votes for its
por lo que era
adoption,
previsible un
meaning
resultado
that a similar
análogo.
outcome was
¿Por qué
predictable.
enfrentar a este Consejo un
Why
proceso
put this
inútil
Council through a
sobre el cual ya se
useless
conocía su
process
resultado?
when the result was already
Es
known?
preocupante la polarización y la
There is a
confrontación
worrisome and
crecientes
increasing
en la consideración de
polarization,
temas que competen a este
confrontation in
Consejo.
considering matters within the mandate of this Council. Such matters confer upon its members an individual and collective responsibility to seek constructive solutions to face global challenges, including the questions of weapons in outer space. We must not politicize the Security Council and use it as just one more arena which exposes today's geopolitical tensions. To conclude, President, I reaffirm Ecuador's commitment to continue to act in accordance with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations upon the basis of dialogue and cooperation between its members. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
I thank you, President.
La France a voté contre le projet de résolution présenté aujourd'hui. Nous déplorons la méthode d'obstruction qui a été employée par la Russie, qui ne cherchait manifestement qu'à diviser le Conseil et à renverser la responsabilité de l'échec de ce projet de texte sans sincèrement soutenir les objectifs. Le vote de la France aujourd'hui reflète notre refus de la méthode. Le 24 avril, la Russie opposait son veto au projet de résolution sur l'espace extra-atmosphérique qui a été préparé par les États-Unis et le Japon. Nous souhaitons saluer une nouvelle fois les efforts qui avaient été déployés par ces deux États au cours de discussions ouvertes pour parvenir à un compromis. Leur projet réaffirmait l'importance du traité de 1967 qui est le fondement du droit international spécial. Il soulignait le rôle d'instances spécialisées comme la conférence du désarmement pour continuer à développer le régime juridique applicable à l'espace. Après avoir bloqué seule l'adoption de ce texte, la Russie soumet au Conseil un projet alternatif dont 15 paragraphes sont issus directement de la proposition portée par les États-Unis et le Japon. Il est permis de s'étonner que la Russie ait opposé son veto à un texte dont elle s'est inspirée aussi largement pour son propre projet. La position de la France est claire. Nous soutenons les paragraphes qui rappellent le rôle du traité de 1967, mais la Russie cherche à imposer de nouvelles dispositions qui n'ont fait qu'éloigner le Conseil d'un accord. Ces ajouts visent à introduire des références à la proposition d'un traité sur la prévention du placement d'armes dans l'espace. Cette proposition ne recueille pas le consensus et elle fait l'objet de débats dans les enceintes de désarmement. La France nourrit des réserves à l'égard de cette proposition de traité qui se heurterait à l'écueil de la définition des termes et de la mise en place de mécanismes effectifs de vérification. Lors des négociations sur ce projet de résolution, nous avons appelé, comme de nombreux autres membres du Conseil, à ne pas préjuger des débats en cours dans les enceintes de désarmement. Dans un esprit de compromis, nous avions accepté que le projet ne mentionne pas la réduction des menaces spatiales par la définition de normes de comportement responsables, alors que 170 États avaient soutenu la résolution promouvant cette approche en première commission de l'Assemblée générale. La Russie, pour sa part, a persisté à vouloir introduire dans le texte sa proposition de traité et elle savait qu'une majorité de membres du Conseil ne la soutenait. C'est ce refus de négociation, tout comme le veto qu'elle a utilisé il y a quelques semaines, qui permettent de douter de la crédibilité qui est de la Russie lorsqu'elle prétend unir la communauté internationale dans la négociation d'un accord sur la prévention d'une course aux armements dans l'espace. Monsieur le Président, il est dans l'intérêt de tous que l'espace extra-atmosphérique demeure sûr, stable et qu'il soit utilisé à des fins pacifiques. La France est attachée au respect du traité de 1967, du droit international ainsi qu'à la prévention d'une course aux armements dans l'espace. Pour avancer vers cet objectif, elle est mobilisée dans les discussions des enceintes compétentes de désarmement, y compris sur la définition d'engagements politiques et d'instruments contraignants appropriés. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone reaffirms its commitment to promoting peace, security, and stability in outer space and beyond. In line with our principal stance on preventing the weaponization of outer space, Sierra Leone voted on 24th April 2024 in favor of the previous draft resolution, which was sponsored by Japan and the US and co-sponsored by 65 member states on weapons of mass destruction in outer space, which was not adopted owing to a non-concurring vote of a permanent member. We also voted for the amendment proposed by the Russian Federation and China, recognizing the urgent need for measures to prevent the placement of weapons in outer space. Sierra Leone has voted in favor of this draft resolution S/2024/383 to re-echo our consistent and fundamental belief in the peaceful uses of outer space and prevent any potential militarization. We observe that the draft resolution sponsored by the Russian Federation largely comprises elements of the draft Security Council resolution co-authored by Japan and the US, which was not adopted. We recognize the concerns of some Security Council members regarding a lack of broad consensus on broad elements of the draft. However, the urgency of preventing any militarization of outer space necessitates strong and decisive measures. Sierra Leone family believes that the adoption of any resolution which calls for the prevention of an arms race in outer space is a pivotal step towards mitigating the risk. In conclusion, Sierra Leone remains dedicated to the pursuit of peace and security in outer space. Our vote in favor of the draft resolution signifies our commitment to maintaining outer space as a sanctuary for peaceful activities, free from threats, military confrontation, and conflicts prevalent on Earth, a realm where humanity can unify in the pursuit of knowledge, exploration, and mutual advancement. We call upon all member states to collaborate honestly in future negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament to develop a universally accepted, legally binding framework that will safeguard our shared outer space heritage for the betterment of present and future generations. Sierra Leone stands ready to continue its constructive engagement in these vital discussions to ensure that outer space remains a secure and peaceful environment for present and future generations.